For Spy Eyes Only, an Onyx Sector adventure, written by Craig A. Hart and S.J. Varango. Prologue. Amanda Pickering wasn't dressed for slumming. Her Carolina Herrera black gown clung to her like a second skin, its delicate silk shimmering faintly under the dim streetlights, utterly out of place in the grimy alley far from Rue de Lyon, the Opera Bastille, and her husband, Barton Pickering III. The air was thick with the stench of rotting garbage and damp stone, a far cry from the jasmine-scented lobby of the Hotel Esmeralda, where she'd begun her evening. Concern for Bart, the love of her life, clawed at her chest, tightening her breath. She tried to calm herself by picturing him pacing the opulent venue, his brow furrowed in frustration at her tardiness, looking devastatingly handsome in his immaculately tailored Armani tuxedo, the crisp white shirt catching the glow of the chandeliers. But the image felt hollow, a fragile fantasy that crumbled under the weight of her growing fear that something far more sinister was at work. The alley wasn't simply dark, it was an abyss, swallowing light and hope alike. Not even a flicker of illumination escaped the single window she could make out 2 stories above, its glass smeared with grime and neglect. The rats, bold and unapologetic, scurried through the heaps of garbage that lined the narrow passage, their claws scratching against the cobblestones. A discarded newspaper, its headlines smudged and illegible, skittered across her path, carried by a sudden gust that smelled faintly of diesel and decay. Amanda's stiletto heels clicked sharply with each cautious step, the sound echoing off the damp brick walls, a metronome to her rising pulse. Amanda looked at her watch. Precisely 58 minutes ago, she had hailed a cab to meet Bart at the Opera Bastille, her gown and strategically draped shawl designed to ensure his eyes would be on her, not Mozart Don Giovanni. But as soon as the cab door slammed shut, she knew she'd be late for the opening curtain. The driver, a wiry man with a jagged scar tracing his left cheek, had lurched into Paris's chaotic traffic, ignoring the blaring horns and shouted curses from other drivers. Without a word, he reached through the narrow plexiglass partition and thrust a compact phone into her hand. It was an odd hybrid, a satellite phone, its stubby antenna evoking outdated, cordless models, its matte black casing cold against her palm. Prenez le téléphone, he grunted, his voice rough as gravel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Merci, she replied, not the least bit thankful. She knew exactly whose voice she would hear. Yes, sir. As always, the voice of J. Carlton Moore sounded like a cigar being snipped for lighting. Diva, you're not going to the opera tonight. I had a feeling, she said, wincing at the code name that had been assigned to her years ago, long before she'd become a regular at opera houses across Europe. Its use was a signal flare, a warning that trouble was brewing. What's going on? Barton made a serious mistake tonight. He had arranged to meet the courier during the intermission and was carrying some extremely sensitive documents in a titanium clutch tucked into the inner pocket of his tuxedo. Why would he arrange to meet a courier at the opera house when he could have just picked up his phone at the embassy and had one knocking on his office door 10 seconds later? Not the kind of documents one transfers at his workplace, even if his workplace is the U.S. Embassy, Moore replied, his tone heavy with implication. Damn, said Amanda, beginning to get the picture. Bart wasn't just a diplomat. He was a high-level operative for Onyx Sector, and those documents were likely tied to something far more dangerous than trade agreements or diplomatic cables. We've suspected Scorpion had ears in the embassy for some time. Now it would seem we were right. Barton was intercepted somewhere between your hotel and the opera house. He was walking? Amanda's voice rose incredulous. The Hotel Esmeralda is all the way across the Seine from the opera. Not a bad strategy if one wants to appear carefree, Moore said. Also, he knows how cab rides have a way of being unpredictable. Amanda caught the irony in his voice and glanced at the driver, whose studied indifference to their conversation was almost theatrical. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles pale, and a faint sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead despite the cool night air. He was no ordinary cabbie, likely an Onyx Sector asset, if not a full-fledged agent. The realization did little to ease her nerves. Did we have eyes on him? Until right before he was taken, yes, as we knew there was a chance for trouble, Moore said. He took an unexpected turn onto Rue Beautreilly, we think to buy flowers. How sweet, Amanda said, her sarcasm tinged with genuine affection. Bart's romantic gestures, like stopping for a bouquet of her favorite peonies, were one of the many reasons she adored him, even if they sometimes led to disaster. Indeed, that was when they took him. No one saw a thing, not even the flower vendor who claimed she was distracted by a spilled crate of roses. But we should know where they took him, Amanda pressed. He's chipped. As a high-level diplomat and Onyx operative, Bart had been given the option to have a subcutaneous transmitter implanted. Knowing he was a prime target for groups like Scorpion, he'd agreed, though not without complaint. The chip, a marvel of nanotechnology, was nestled between the first and second toes on his left foot, a location chosen for its discretion. Amanda could still hear his exaggerated groans about the procedure, his dramatic claims that the pain was worse than a gunshot wound. Indeed, Moore intoned, precisely why your driver has, by now, left anything remotely resembling the safer sections of Paris. Amanda peered out the taxi's smudged window, her breath catching as she registered the surroundings. The streets had narrowed into a labyrinth of crumbling facades and flickering streetlights, the buildings leaning inward as if conspiring to block out the sky. Graffiti and jagged French scrawled across a shuttered storefront, and a stray dog slunk past, its ribs stark against its mangy fur. The landscape was devolving by the second, each turn plunging her deeper into a Paris she barely recognized. She didn't need further explanation, and the two sharp disconnection tones in her ear confirmed she wouldn't get any. Prenez le suivi, the driver said, once again reaching back to her. This time he handed her an electronic tracking device, its sleek design reminiscent of an iPhone from a decade ago, its screen glowing with a blinking red blip. Bart's chip. He was close, closer than she dared hope. She slid the tracker into her handbag, a compact Dior clutch that also held two other items, a mirrored compact for touch-ups and a purse-sized 9mm pistol, its grip customized to fit her hand. She left the compact untouched, her focus on the weapon's reassuring weight. It had now been exactly 60 minutes since she'd hailed the cab, and Amanda was navigating the rat-infested alley, her heels sinking slightly into the uneven cobblestones. The tracker's audible signal pulsed in her ears, a steady rhythm that quickened with each step. She'd adjusted her shawl, draping one end over her right hand to conceal the pistol, its barrel glinting faintly when it caught the scant light. Her handbag hung open, allowing quick glances at the tracker's screen, though the signal's increasing tempo told her she was closing in. The beeping was now relentless, like a smoke detector with a dying battery grating on her nerves. Bart, or at least his chip, was no more than 5 or 10 feet away. Her foot struck something solid, the impact jarring her ankle. She pulled the tracker from her handbag and angled its screen downward, the faint glow illuminating a discarded shoe amid the alley's filth. At first, she dismissed it as another piece of urban debris, her eyes flicking away, but something about it, its polished leather, its elegant design, drew her gaze back. It was a men's dress shoe, Italian made, the kind Bart favored for formal occasions. Her heart stuttered as she registered the grotesque truth. The shoe wasn't empty. A severed foot, still encased in a black silk sock, protruded from it, the flesh pale and bloodless. Amanda's breath caught, her mind teetering between the urge to reach down and confirm the unthinkable and the instinct to flee. Before she could decide, a blur of motion in her peripheral vision exploded into a searing pain at the base of her skull. The world tilted, the alley's shadows swallowing her up as everything went black. 1. Perry's alarm had been shrieking for 10 minutes, its relentless beeping slicing through the fog of his unconsciousness, but it was the quiet, insistent whine of Fleming, his English bulldog, that finally dragged him into the waking world. As he did every morning, he reached out a heavy hand to pat the dog's wrinkled head, his fingers brushing the velvety folds of skin. "Okay, buddy," he mumbled. "Okay." For several minutes, that was the extent of his ambition. His body sprawled across the cold hardwood floor of his Upper East Side penthouse. Fleming whimpered again, this time pressing his icy wet nose against Perry's ear, a sensation sharp enough to jolt him. The dog's heft, 60 pounds of stubborn, sagging flesh, made it impossible for him to clamber onto the bed, which meant only one thing. Perry cracked open one eye, wincing as the room tilted. He wasn't in bed. He was on the floor, his cheek pressed against the polished oak, a faint smear of drool beneath him. "Well, shit," he said, the words tasting of stale liquor. He forced his other eye open, hoping to coax his depth perception into cooperation, but the world remained stubbornly flat and blurry. As his vision sharpened, 3 objects swam into focus, clustered together in a grim still life. A vodka bottle, tipped onto its side, its last drops long gone. Fleming's stainless steel dog dish scraped clean, and a single sheet of letter-sized paper propped against the bowl, its surface apparently blank. After a moment, he realized the bottle wasn't entirely empty. A faint shimmer of liquid clung to its inner curve, mocking him. He swatted the bottle away, its glass clinking as it rolled across the floor, and he sat up, his head throbbing in protest. Fleming let out a sound that was half pleading growl, half exasperated sigh, his dark eyes glinting with canine judgment. The bulldog's jowls quivered as he shifted his weight, his stubby legs splayed beneath his barrel-like body. Perry nodded and rubbed his temples. I know, don't preach." For several minutes he remained where he was, unable to decide on his next move, and unsure he could pull off a next move even if he came up with one. A sudden booming bark from Fleming cut through his indecision, the sound reverberating off the penthouse's high ceilings like a gunshot. That was loud, and just mean, Perry grumbled, shooting the dog a bleary glare. But the bark did its job. He hauled himself to his feet, swaying as the room spun. Fleming's stubby tail began to wag, a frantic blur of motion, as if the dog sensed his human might not keel over and die after all. Perry took a moment to steady himself. All the parts of the vodka he appreciated were done with him now, leaving the parts that led him to suspect the Cold War had never ended. He reached out for one of the smoothly carved marble columns that marked the separation of the dining area and the kitchen in his well-appointed apartment. After a moment, he made his way into the kitchen and pushed a button on his coffee maker. 3 years of periodic, frequent, heavy drinking had trained him that setting up the coffee pot the night before was a necessary and a holy thing. He then moved to a blue plastic storage bin and pulled off the top. As he did, Fleming's non-tail spun even more rapidly, the delicious odor of kibble reaching his flat nose. Perry reached in and used the empty cottage cheese container that sat amongst the dog food to scoop out a healthy serving. As he walked to Fleming's empty dish, he shook the container, causing the food to rattle. "Just as you like it, pal," he said. "Shaken, not stirred." He dumped the food, mostly in the bowl, and smiled at his own joke. The dog was, after all, named in honor of Ian Fleming, creator of James Bond, and even though he uttered the same lame quip every morning when he fed him, Perry was sure Fleming was laughing on the inside as he began to loudly devour the dry food. "Too loud. Crunch quietly," Perry chided, wincing as the noise stabbed at his headache. The 7-year-old rascal expertly ignored him. Perry gave up and shuffled back to the kitchen, pouring himself a mug of coffee so strong he could strip paint. The steam curled upward, warming his face as he took a cautious sip. His free hand drifted to the refrigerator door, where a photograph was held in place by a magnet shaped like a bunch of bananas, its bright yellow plastic chipped at the edges. The woman in the photo was in her late 20s, her long blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes a piercing blue that seemed to shift the very definition of the color. "Good morning, Trina," he whispered, his fingers brushing the photo's edge, the ache in his chest as raw as ever. Taking a long sip of the steaming joe, Perry turned his attention back to the piece of paper he'd noticed upon opening his eyes. Even in his current condition, which day to day was somewhere between actively suicidal and flatline apathetic, he tried to maintain the apartment the way Trina had left it, and paper on the floor was a no-no. The letter-sized sheet was still close enough to Fleming's bowl to elicit a good-natured growl as he reached for it. "I just want the paper, Goofus, not your food." The paper was, as he'd first suspected, quite blank. He stared at it for a full 10 seconds before enough brain cells fired and he thought to turn it over. But the reverse was pristine as well. Finding a blank sheet of paper on the floor after another night of blackout drinking wouldn't raise red flags for most, but Perry wasn't most people. Beneath the self-destructive haze and the probable alcoholism, he was still an operative for Onyx Sector, an international organization that operated in the shadows beyond governmental oversight. 10 years of training had honed instincts that even vodka couldn't fully dull. Try as he might, he still hadn't wiped out the instincts and training that 10 years of being an agent had nurtured. He knew the unmarked sheet was anything but empty. Perry downed another swig of coffee and shuffled into his study, a small room off the dining area, mercifully requiring only a few steps. Half sitting, half falling into his brown leather chair, he pulled open a drawer on the dark mahogany antique desk, withdrawing a device that looked like a cross between a flashlight and a magnifying glass. At first inspection, it appeared to be a sort of gadget used by stamp collectors to view details of their treasures, but as he flicked the switch on its body, it bathed the paper in a pale purplish light. The UV bulb brought 3 sentences into clear focus. "Sober up. Feed your dog. I'm waiting in the garage." The words were Lindsay Archer's, another Onyx operative and a lifelong friend. Her script was unmistakable, sharp, efficient, with a slight flourish on the Y that betrayed her private school upbringing. Lindsay was a striking woman, but Perry had never looked at her with anything but platonic affection. Since Trina's death, a word that still felt like a blade in his gut, Lindsay had been a steady presence, pulling him back from the edge time and again, even as he spiraled from Onyx's top agent to the one they called for missions where survival was a long shot. He started moving toward the door to his private elevator, which meant walking much farther than he'd managed up to that point, when he remembered the first part of the terse directive: sober up. He downed the coffee and poured a second cup, drinking that rapidly as well. He stepped into the elevator and pushed the button marked SB, indicating the sub-basement garage. Just as the door opened to the cavernous space, he thought to make sure he was wearing pants. Thankfully, he was, and he stepped into the dimly lit area, moving instinctively to his red Ferrari 488 Spider, its sleek curves gleaming faintly under the garage's fluorescent lights. 2. You look like hell. Lindsay Archer's voice cut through the stale air of the Ferrari's cockpit as Perry landed heavily behind the wheel, the leather seat creaking under his weight. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, flicked over him from the passenger seat, taking in the dark circles under his eyes and the faint tremor in his hands. "Good to see you, too," he replied dryly. "I'm serious, Perry. Every time I see you, you're a little less my childhood friend and a little more one of the zombies from Night of the Living Dead." Her words were blunt, but her voice carried a thread of worry, her hair catching the dim glow of the garage's fluorescent lights as she leaned closer. "That's kind of the point," Perry said, his lips twisting into a bitter half-smile. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair and shifted his gaze to the Ferrari's dashboard, avoiding her piercing stare. "No, Perry, it is very much not the point." Lindsay's voice sharpened, her frustration breaking through. "Damn it, I know losing her crushed you. It would have messed me up, too. Hell, it did mess me up. Everyone loved Trina. Her laugh, her warmth, the way she made every room feel brighter. But do you think for 1 minute this is how she'd want you to be living? Drowning in vodka, barely holding it together?" Perry's eyes hardened, his jaw tightening as a familiar anger flared in his chest. "I didn't lose my wife, Venus," he said, spitting out her code name to signal his irritation, the word sharp and deliberate. "She was taken from me. Taken by a scorpion agent we know only by legend and a horrid nickname, Flick. A very hard lead to run down." The name hung in the air like a curse. Perry had met Trina in Paris during a high-stakes assignment that had him posing as an international investment banker. Despite the risks, despite the lies he'd have to tell, he'd fallen for her hard. He'd kept her in the dark about his true work for Onyx, spinning a convincing tale of boardrooms and stock portfolios, his Upper East Side penthouse and tailored suits lending credence to the ruse. 6 months after they'd married in a quiet civil ceremony at New York's City Hall, with Lindsay standing up for Trina, who had no family or friends in the city. The memory of that day, Trina in a simple white dress, her eyes sparkling with joy, still felt like a knife in Perry's gut. Their honeymoon had been a stolen week in Paris, a blur of candlelit dinners and walks along the Seine. But duty called, and they'd parted at Charles de Gaulle Airport, Trina heading back to New York, while Perry boarded a flight for a business trip that was anything but. She'd remained blissfully unaware of his double life until the night everything shattered. Perry had drilled into her the importance of checking the security monitor beside their penthouse door before opening it, a precaution he'd insisted was standard for anyone with his supposed wealth. But Trina, ever trusting, had switched off the monitor that night, claiming its faint glow disturbed Fleming's sleep. When a soft knock came, she'd opened the door without hesitation. Had she checked the screen, she would have seen a well-built man dressed in black leather pants and jacket, a turtleneck sweater, also black, pulled high up and close to the chin. A dark newsboy's hat, pulled low over the eyes, completed the ensemble that should have warned her to run to the secure room, something she'd been told all investment bankers had, and push the illuminated yellow button that would have summoned the police. But she hadn't seen anything, because she'd switched the monitor off earlier, feeling its glow disturbed Fleming's beauty sleep. She'd opened the door and scarcely saw the flick of the man's hand, an action from which his name was derived. But she felt the sharp blade pierce her throat, severing her carotid artery, instantly dooming her. As she crumpled to the ground in a spreading pool of her own blood, the monitor's security mic picked up a man with a distinct Mediterranean accent say, "As you die, think of this. Your husband is not a banker. He's a spy. He did this to you." The digital audio file was all Perry had left of that night, a haunting loop he'd played 1,000 times, memorizing every inflection, every pause. Onyx's voice analysis unit had scoured it for leads, but the speaker remained a ghost. The crime scene photos were worse, seared into Perry's mind with cruel clarity. Trina's body, stripped naked post-mortem, her clothing wadded up and placed under her head like a grotesque pillow, the floor slick with her blood. Flick's cruelty hadn't ended with her death. He'd staged her body to taunt Perry, to ensure the wound would never heal. Lindsay reached out, gripping Perry's hand, her fingers warm against his clammy skin. The anger in her voice softened, replaced by a raw compassion. "I know, Perry," she said. "And someday, somehow, we'll find Flick. And no matter who runs him down, we'll save him for you. I promise. But I need you to pull it together now. I need to talk to Eagle." Hearing his code name was like a jolt of electricity, flipping a switch in Perry's battered psyche. For reasons he couldn't fully articulate, the call to duty still reached him, even through the haze of grief and self-destruction. His own life meant nothing to him, but the lives of his fellow agents, the innocents they protected, they still mattered. He straightened in the seat, his bloodshot eyes sharpening with a flicker of the operative he used to be. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice steadier now, the fog in his mind parting just enough to let him focus. Lindsay's lips twitched in the briefest of smiles, a glimmer of relief in her expression. "You're not quite Eagle yet. You need some food." "I know just the place," Perry said, his hand already moving to the ignition. The Ferrari's engine roared to life, a deep, throaty growl that vibrated through the car's frame. He punched the garage door opener, the heavy metal gate rumbling upward. Before Lindsay could question whether he was fit to drive, he gunned the accelerator, the Spider surging out of the underground garage and onto Fifth Avenue. The morning light hit them like a spotlight, the city's pulse thrumming around them, honking cabs, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant wail of a siren. Perry gripped the wheel, the familiar rush of adrenaline nudging aside the ache in his chest, if only for a moment. 3. In Manhattan, traffic didn't discriminate. Whether you were behind the wheel of a gleaming red Ferrari 488 Spider or a battered Volkswagen Beetle, you were doomed to crawl through the city's congested arteries. The streets moved as a single monstrous entity, a sluggish beast that set its own maddening pace, indifferent to urgency or status. Perry Hall was accustomed to this daily torment, but familiarity bred no affection. His patience, already frayed by a lingering hangover and the weight of too many ghosts, snapped as he leaned out the window, his voice morphing into a thick New York drawl that belied his otherwise accentless speech. "Come on, lady, the gas pedal is a long, skinny one. Put your foot on it," he bellowed at the driver of a Prius idling in front of him, her hesitation clogging the flow of Fifth Avenue's morning chaos. Horns blared in agreement, a cacophony that only deepened his scowl. "Charming," Lindsay said from the passenger seat, her laughter bright and teasing despite the tension in the car, eyes sparkling with amusement at Perry's sudden transformation into a quintessential New Yorker. Perry had enough wealth to live indefinitely in his sprawling penthouse at Fifth Avenue and East 82nd Street, a sleek monument to modernist luxury with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of Central Park that would make even the most jaded billionaire pause. Onyx paid its top operatives handsomely, and the high-risk missions Perry took, ones where survival was a coin toss, came with bonuses that padded his accounts further. But the real cushion was the inheritance from his parents, whose flight from Boston to L.A. ended abruptly at the South Tower, taking them along with the 63 others on the flight, and countless more in the building. Lindsay, whose family had been intertwined with the Halls since she and Perry were kids, sneaking fireworks in Greenwich backyards, knew the jagged edges of that loss. She'd seen the light in Perry's eyes dim that day, and she must have wondered why he stayed in New York, where every skyscraper and street corner held a memory of grief. Eventually, the crawling traffic beast oozed forward enough for them to reach their destination, the Midnight Express Diner on 2nd Avenue, its neon sign flickering faintly in the morning light. The diner was a relic, its chrome-edged facade and checkered floor evoking a 1950s nostalgia that clashed with the city's relentless modernity. The air inside was thick with the scent of frying bacon and burnt coffee, a comforting assault on the senses. Lindsay groaned as they stepped out of the car. What is it with men and diner food? It's efficient, Perry said, his voice gravelly but laced with a hint of mischief. Gets the blood pumping while simultaneously clogging your arteries. 2 for the price of 1. Perry jacked the Spider into a parking spot, miraculously right in front of the diner. Lindsay emitted a resigned sigh. How is it you can't go faster than 2 miles an hour in New York, but you find a parking spot? As she opened the door, she noticed blue paint on the curb. Perry, this is a Her words broke off as Perry dangled a handicapped placard on his rear view. Is there no limit to the depths you will sink? There may be, Perry said, pushing the security button on the key fob. Right now, I'm still falling. The car chirped obediently, and they walked inside. The diner's bell jingled above the door. The interior was a time capsule. Red vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked since the Reagan administration, and a counter lined with regulars hunched over steaming mugs. Hey, Bob, called a large and friendly-looking waitress from behind the counter, her apron stained with grease and her hair piled into a haphazard bun. Hey, Belle, Perry replied, sliding into an empty booth by a window which provided him a view of both the door and his car, Spycraft and Motorhead 101. The usual? Belle asked, her pen already poised over her notepad. Yep, Perry said, settling back against the vinyl. And for your friend? Better wipe off a menu for her. She's classy, Perry said with a wink. The waitress smiled and reached behind the counter, pulling out a dust-covered menu. Most of the Midnight Express's patrons came in knowing what they wanted. She came to their table, wiping the laminated menu clean with a damp cloth that was probably dirtier than the dust. Choose quickly, Perry said. They turn tables over fast in here, and my meal will probably be delivered before you make your selection. Just coffee, then, Lindsay said, closing the menu with a decisive snap and sliding it to the table's edge. Hell no, eating was your idea, Perry countered. He raised his voice to catch Belle's attention as she retreated. She'll have 2 slices of raisin toast. Lindsay smiled. You still remember my favorite childhood comfort food, and my idea was getting you to eat something. I'm not the one who looks partially embalmed. Don't be so insulting. I look fully embalmed, Perry shot back, a ghost of his old humor surfacing. True to his prediction, the food arrived with startling speed, the plates clattering onto the table before Lindsay's coffee had even cooled. Perry's order was a heart attack on a platter, 3 eggs over easy, their yolks glistening like liquid gold, a pile of crispy bacon and thick-cut ham, and a mountain of home fries, golden and speckled with caramelized onions, enough to feed a small family. A separate plate held a toasted bagel, slathered with a generous layer of cream cheese and dripping with melted butter that pooled on the porcelain. Lindsay fixed Perry with a disapproving look worthy of even the judgiest mother. Must everything you do be life-threatening? It's my M.O., he said, shoveling a forkful of home fries into his mouth, the grease and salt a fleeting comfort. They fell into a brief silence, the clatter of cutlery and the low hum of diner chatter filling the space. The quiet was shattered when 2 scruffy teenagers lingered too close to the Spider, their hoodies and low-slung jeans giving them an air of casual menace. Perry's hand moved instinctively, pulling his Walter PPKS 380 from the holster beneath his jacket. He tapped the gun's barrel against the window, the sharp clink cutting through the diner's din, and wagged the forefinger of his other hand in a no-no gesture. The teens froze, their eyes widening before they bolted down the sidewalk. Lindsay's jaw dropped, her voice a harsh whisper. Perry, are you insane? That's a major breach of protocol. Belle, unfazed, sauntered over with a coffee carafe, her expression one of mild exasperation. Bobby, you know the rules, she said, topping off their mugs. You can't shoot the neighborhood kids. Perry huffed as he slid the gun back into the holster under his jacket. This country is totally going down the tubes, he muttered. Still, he couldn't totally conceal a smirk of satisfaction at the teenager's speed of departure. I was mainly using it because it makes such a good noise on the window. I'll give you a good noise, Belle retorted, refilling their coffees. Why they let a security guard carry a gun like that is beyond me. When the waitress wandered away to assist customers at the other end of the diner, Lindsay leaned across the table and whispered, Bob, the security guard, is that the best you could come up with? You really have slipped. Perry shot her a dark look. Excuse me, you're the one still writing invisible messages? And how many security guards drive Ferraris? Maybe 10%? Try again. Perry's voice took on a mock whine, a flicker of their old banter surfacing. I don't know, I don't have the research stats right in front of me at the moment. I don't need research to say that exactly 0 security guards drive Ferraris, Lindsay said, her voice tinged with exasperation. 0% seems awfully low, Perry replied, popping a piece of bacon into his mouth, his smirk widening. Lindsay sighed, shaking her head. Rich people really do lose touch with reality, don't they? I certainly hope so, Perry said, his voice heavy with resignation. Reality sucks. Lindsay let the matter drop, her gaze softening as she watched Perry mop up the last of his egg yolk with a piece of bagel, the cream cheese smearing across his plate. The diner's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the gauntness of his cheeks and the faint tremor in his hand. Feeling better? She asked, her tone gentle but probing. Yes. No, not really, Perry muttered, his eyes flicking to the window where the spider gleamed under the morning sun. You? My toast was perfect, Lindsay said, a small smile tugging at her lips as she slid out of the booth, her movements graceful despite the cramped space. Perry snorted, tossing a crumpled $50 bill under the saucer of his coffee mug, its edges stained with grease. I hope you didn't get overly full on your single slice of 4-inch square toasted raisin bread. Couldn't eat another bite, she replied, her voice light but her eyes carrying a weight that matched his own. She waved to Belle as they headed for the door, the bell jingling faintly behind them. Perry's charm, rough-edged but genuine, made him a favorite with people like Belle, but the generous tip for a $12 breakfast didn't hurt either. The waitress's warm smile followed them out, a small oasis of kindness in Perry's fractured world. 4. They climbed into the Ferrari and headed off. Perry gunned the engine, cutting off a yellow taxi to merge into the sluggish flow of Fifth Avenue traffic. The cabbie's curses were drowned out by the spider's throaty roar. So, Eagle is ready to listen if Venus is ready to talk, he said, his voice steadier now, the code name anchoring him. He turned left from 89th Street back onto Fifth Avenue, the Metropolitan Museum of Art looming ahead. Without signaling, he swung into a small lot in front of the museum and slid into a spot marked Chief Curator Only, the sign's bold letters glaring accusingly. Lindsay raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of amusement and disbelief. He's out of town till Friday, Perry said, preempting her question, and I want to walk in the park. I've already been in your apartment while you were resting, Lindsay said, her tone dry. You don't have to be shy about us talking there. Shyness has nothing to do with it, Perry replied, stepping out of the car and locking it with a chirp of the key fob. Fleming's food will be gone by now, and I guarantee he's already starting converting it to methane. The park, on its worst day, is better than Flem at his least gassy. They left the spider behind, its red curves drawing curious glances from tourists snapping photos of the museum. Lindsay's posture stiffened as an actual security guard approached, his navy uniform crisp and his badge glinting in the sunlight. Her hand twitched toward her jacket, where Perry knew she kept a compact Sig Sauer P365, but the guard broke into a grin. "Don't forget to be out by closing time, Danny," the man called, waving cheerfully. "No problem, Paco," Perry called over his shoulder as they walked to the end of the lot and turned right towards Central Park. At this entrance, Central Park unfolded like a green sanctuary carved from Manhattan's concrete heart. The air was crisp, scented with damp earth and blooming lilacs, a stark contrast to the diner's grease-laden atmosphere. Paths diverged ahead, one leading through a copse of towering oaks to the softball fields, another veering right toward the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir, its vast surface shimmering under the morning sky. Perry chose the water, his boots crunching on the graveled path as the reservoir's calm expanse came into view, joggers and dog walkers dotting its perimeter. "How many identities do you have?" Lindsay asked. "Aren't you afraid you'll forget one day and answer to Danny when you're actually Bob? Don't forget Sammy, Will, and Ethan. More aliases? Seems a bit like overkill." "It's a hobby," he shot back, his jaw tightening. "I'm beginning to feel like you rolled into town with the sole intention of making me feel like a toddler." "I'm sorry, Perry," Lindsay said, her voice softening. "I'm just worried about you, and I care about you." "I appreciate that, Venus, but sometimes having people care is the worst thing about living." The use of the code name made it clear Perry was ready to abandon the personal for business. Lindsay stopped short. Her arms crossed and her eyes narrowed. "Now listen, Perry, that's enough. You've had a really shitty time of it, I get that. And my heart breaks for you. But you have so much potential, so much talent, so many resources most others don't." Perry felt a surge of rage in his chest. "Are you saying I should just get the hell over it?" "No." Lindsay reached out, grabbing his shoulders, her grip firm but not unkind. "No, Perry, I don't like seeing you waste away, killing yourself. And it kills me to hear you say cynical, empty things like you've completely given up." The burning resentment lingered, but Perry knew Lindsay truly cared and had his best interest at heart. In fact, Lindsay was one of the most genuine people he knew. Somehow she had kept the rigors of the job, including its requirement that its agents live complete and total lies on a regular basis, from taking over her girl next door character and personality. Not that she hadn't faced her own hardships. This knowledge helped blunt Perry's anger. Lindsay knew what heartbreak felt like. "I know, Linz," he said, his voice softer now. "And I appreciate the concern, really I do. I'm dealing with it, in my own way and on my own time, okay?" The look on Lindsay's face suggested she had grave doubts concerning Perry's claim, but the resignation in her eyes meant she also understood that pursuing the issue now would be ineffective and perhaps even detrimental. Instead, she became businesslike and brisk. "So listen, I don't have all the details. Moore will discuss them with you directly when you get home and call him in." She glanced at her sleek Tag Heuer watch, its face glinting in the sunlight. 45 minutes. But I can tell you this much. We've lost an operative and her diplomat husband." "Amanda and Bart?" Perry asked without hesitation, his mind, foggy as it was, snapping to the names with a precision of a well-oiled machine. Amanda Pickering, codenamed Diva, and Barton Pickering III, a high-level diplomat and Onyx asset. Lindsay nodded, her expression grim. "A missing persons job," Perry said, his brow furrowing. "Not usually my area of operation. And it's in Paris. Yes, I know." Perry's gaze dropped to the ground, his pace quickening as the weight of the city settled on his shoulders. Paris. The city where he'd met Trina, where they'd fallen in love against all reason, where they'd spent their honeymoon wandering cobblestone streets and sipping wine in candlelit bistros. Speeding up to keep pace with him, Lindsay vented her frustration once again. "Damn it, Perry, I get it. It's the last place you and Trina were together before she flew home and you flew to Bucharest, but let's face it, there are fewer and fewer places in the world that don't hold a memory of some personal tragedy for any of us. You most of all. Shut up, he said, sounding like a sullen 10-year-old, but immediately followed up with, So what else is going on? Two people go dark, Moore calls you or another agent, not me. Moore sent me to roust you, not to brief you, so again, I don't know, Lindsay said, her voice tinged with exasperation. They reached an empty bench overlooking the reservoir, its weathered wood creaking as Perry sat down heavily, his eyes still fixed on the gravel at his feet. Lindsay settled beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, a quiet anchor in the storm of his thoughts. Look, if nothing else, it will give you something to focus on for a while, she said, her voice soft but insistent. I'll be in Paris, Lens, Perry said, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you think I'm going to be focused on? On the damn job. Lindsay's tone sharpened, her patience fraying. Don't screw with me, Perry. When the hammer gets pulled back, you're the most focused person I know. Now go move your car before Paco has it towed, then call Moore. Perry sat in silence for a long minute, his gaze locked on the ground as the reservoir's gentle ripples reflected the sky. Finally, he lifted his eyes, letting out a long, weary sigh. All right. Do you need a ride somewhere? I'll take the subway, Lindsay said, standing and brushing off her jeans. Way safer than riding with you. Despite his mood, Perry grinned at the snide remark. Lindsay stood up and began to walk away. He remained seated until she vanished into the mass of people milling about the park, then put his face in his hands. The image of Trina in front of the Eiffel Tower, posing for the obligatory Paris tourist picture, the very picture that now hung on his refrigerator right before they kissed and headed off in two different cabs, burned in his memory. With a growl, he rubbed his face violently and shot up from the bench. Looking at his watch, he saw there was now about 20 minutes until Moore was expecting his call. Moore was a little weird, but he wasn't unnecessarily cruel, and he cared about his people. If he thought he needed Eagle in Paris to hunt down a pair of MIAs, there had to be a damn good reason. 5. Perry walked from his living room to the roof of the building, a lush garden that had no business existing this high in the sky above New York City. Under a canopy sat an outdoor recliner, brown metal with rust-colored cushions, and next to the chair was an innocent-looking lucite pedestal. A bottle of gin, empty and cold, lay on its side atop the transparent rectangle. Perry knocked it off, then slid his hand across the side of the pedestal facing the chair, twice left to right, once downward, once right to left. With a click, a door popped open. Defying logic and observation, it revealed a secure phone. He picked up the receiver and punched the 1 key. Eagle. J. Carlton Moore's voice crackled after a single ring, sharp staccato, like a blade slicing through static. Sir, Perry replied, his tone flat, the word carrying the weight of duty. I know Venus couldn't tell you much, Moore said, his voice cool but laced with an undercurrent of urgency. Only that we have two down, Perry said, leaning back in the recliner, the cushions creaking under his weight. And that is Paris. Unavoidable, I'm afraid, Moore replied, the faintest hint of regret in his tone. Perry's brow furrowed, his fingers tightening around the receiver. A little confused, sir. MIA? Not usually what you ask me to do. Our agent and her husband are probably dead, Moore said, his professionalism unshaken but strained, a subtle crack in his usual armor. Perry knew Moore loathed losing his people. Each loss was a personal blow, no matter how stoic he appeared. They are not the objective. Should you locate one or both, so much the better, but it is the package Pickering was carrying that you're looking for. Package? Perry's voice sharpened, his interest peaked, the fog of his earlier binge lifting like mist under a rising sun. Are you sitting down? Affirmative, Perry said, his tone dry, but his pulse quickening, the recliner's metal frame cold against his back. Bart had been working with the militia group positioned to neutralize a scorpion cell. Moore explained. A cell partnering with some true believers in a particularly unfriendly spot of the Middle East. Perry let out a low scoff. Are there any spots in that theater that are friendly? The question elicited a double ha chuckle, from which Moore indicated a bout of hysterical laughter. Fewer and fewer. The package, then? Perry pressed, shifting forward, the garden's serenity fading as the stakes came into focus. Inside a titanium clutch with no obvious means of entry were an arming key and activation codes for a moderately powerful nuclear device, Moore said, his voice dropping to a grim cadence. Ew, Perry muttered, the word a reflex, his mind already racing through the implications. Just so. The device, we are 90% positive, is in France, probably Paris, and was most likely being prepped for delivery to the aforementioned unfriendly spot. It was to have been a rather emphatic statement, though the target was remote, with minimal risk of excessive collateral damage. If all went well, no Western fingerprints would have been detected. Was being prepped? Perry caught the shift in tense, his instincts flaring. Yes, Moore confirmed. We've picked up chatter indicating that Scorpion, who we're quite sure are behind the abductions, had already secured the device when Bart was taken. With the key and codes, they might prefer to do something a little more eye-catching. Perry let out a low whistle, the sound swallowed by the rooftop's quiet. I don't care much for the sound of that. If you did, you'd be a monster, Moore said, his tone darkening, which leads us to why I wanted to speak to you. There is a tendency, when one wishes to detonate a nuclear device in a major metropolitan area, to be unconcerned with the welfare of anyone getting in their way. Which is right in my wheelhouse, Perry said, a grim smile tugging at his lips. High risk, high body count missions were his specialty now, a far cry from the surgical precision of his earlier days. Always good with a phrase, Eagle, Moore said, a trace of approval in his voice. The specifics, then. JFK to Paris, leaving this evening, 7 p.m., arrive in Paris, 8:30 a.m. Room booked under the name Jared Parker at 1 Rue Augereau. Perry closed his eyes tightly and covered them with his left hand. Damn it. Problem, Eagle? That's the Hotel de Londres, Perry said, his voice barely above a whisper, the name conjuring memories he'd spent years trying to drown. Moore coughed, a rare break in his composure. Your knowledge of foreign lodging accommodations is impressive, but I fail to see— That's where we stayed, Perry cut in, his voice raw. You're killing me, sir. Very possibly. That's why it's your assignment. You have a plane to catch in a few hours. You may want to shower. The line went dead. Perry sat on the terrace for 10 minutes, the phone still to his ear, though he knew Moore, who never said goodbye when ending a call, was long gone. Finally, he placed the receiver back on the base and closed the door on the pedestal, recreating the illusion of transparency once more. He stood and went to the kitchen. Removing the magnet, he took the picture of Trina in his hands, staring at it. He walked numbly to his bedroom and pulled his ready bag from under the bed. He opened it, gently placed the photo inside, then walked into his bathroom, where he turned the shower on as hot as it would go. As the room filled with steam, he stripped out of the clothes he had been wearing for 2, maybe 3 days, and stepped into the water, which streamed powerfully out of the dual shower heads. The pain from the scalding water was instantaneous and gratifying. He stood still until it became unbearable, then turned it as cold as it would go. The new suffering lasted even longer. Finally, he adjusted the dial, found a middle temperature, and washed away the last trace of his weekend binge. Come on, Beth, you have to go away this week? You can't watch Fleming for a few days? Perry said, his voice a mix of exasperation and pleading as he paced the hardwood floor of his penthouse bedroom. He was on the phone with Beth Harper, the 17-year-old from the 14th floor, the only person he trusted to look after Fleming. Her knack for handling the bulldog's quirks, His penchant for stealing socks and his thunderous snores made her indispensable, especially on short notice. I'm sorry, Mr. Drake, Beth said, her tone firm but tinged with teenage impatience. She used the alias Perry maintained in the building, a name as unremarkable as the khakis and button downs he wore to blend in with the Upper East Side's elite. I've been planning this vacation for weeks. It's the end of summer break. School starts next Wednesday. My friends and I are driving to Vermont. Vermont? Perry scoffed, tossing a hand in the air as if she could see his disbelief. You don't want to go there. There's nothing in Vermont but trees and hippies brewing kombucha in barns. Ben and Jerry's and the teddy bear place, she shot back, her voice dripping with the effortless scorn only a teenage girl could wield. The words were clipped, each symbol a reminder of her unwavering resolve. Perry leaned against the bedpost, rubbing his temple. You know, I've heard rumors about what Ben and Jerry do to teddy bears. Dark stuff. You don't want to get mixed up in that. Sorry, Mr. D. Not even one of your wild stories can change my mind, Beth said, her tone final, a verbal door slamming shut. Fine. I hope you have a terrible time, Perry grumbled, his frustration bubbling over. Oh, we will. Wait, what? Disconnect, he barked, the command sharp enough to make Fleming lift his head from the floor. The apartment's AI, a discrete system woven into the penthouse's sleek design, cut the call instantly. Dial Spectruman, Perry ordered, and the speakers embedded in each corner of the room hummed to life, the faint ring echoing off the high ceilings as the system connected to Goran Spectruman, Onyx resident details expert. Talk to me, Eagle, came Spectruman's crisp, Eastern European voice, his thick accent mangling talk into something almost comical. The man's Slovenian roots bled through every syllable, but his encyclopedic knowledge of international logistics made him indispensable. Spec, how many hoops do I have to jump through to get a dog into France? Perry asked, sinking onto the edge of his king-size bed, its charcoal linens still rumpled from his restless night. Driving or flying? Spectruman's tone was all business, the sound of papers shuffling in the background suggesting he was already cross-referencing regulations. Flying tonight. He's chipped? And his shots are all up to date, Perry confirmed, glancing at Fleming, who was now eyeing him with suspicion from his sprawl at the bed's base. You have all documentation? I practically have a passport for him. France not too bad, Spectruman said. Show papers and €100 note. What's that? Administrative fee? Perry asked, a smirk tugging at his lips. Yes, fee. Or bribe. Call what you like. Okay, thanks, Spec. Want anything from Paris? French whore, Spectruman deadpanned, his accent making the crude request sound almost quaint. Barrel of laughs, Spec. Disconnect, Perry said, shaking his head as the line went silent. He crossed the room to one of the 3 closets lining the bedroom's west wall, its sliding door whispering open to reveal a meticulously organized array of suits, tactical gear, and, tucked into the corner, an oversized dog carrier. The carrier, a sturdy black crate with reinforced corners, was twice the size of his go bag and emblazoned with a faded sticker from a long-ago trip to London. Fleming, sensing trouble, let out a sharp interrogative yip and bolted for the door, his stubby legs churning. Hold it, wise guy, Perry said, lunging to grab the bulldog's collar, the leather worn soft from years of use. I know you hate this thing, but I'm in a bind. Besides, just because I can't bring Spec back a hooker doesn't mean you won't meet some nicely perfumed and coiffed poodle. You might get lucky. The promise of canine romance did nothing to sway Fleming, who whined pitifully, his jowls quivering as Perry maneuvered him into the carrier. The dog's bulk made the task a wrestling match, but Perry secured the door with a satisfying click, ignoring the baleful stare from within. He grabbed a file from his nightstand drawer and looked over the contents quickly. All Fleming's pertinent paperwork was in place and in order. Taxi, Perry said, the command activating the AI once more. Instead of dialing a standard cab service, the system sent an encrypted signal to an Onyx Sector garage, dispatching a specialized transport. 15 minutes later, Perry and Fleming were in the back of a vehicle that looked like any yellow New York taxi, its paint chipped and its fenders dented for authenticity. But beneath the surface, it was a fortress. Armored panels, bulletproof glass, and a reinforced chassis designed to withstand far more than a fender bender. The driver, a taciturn man with a scar snaking across his knuckles, handed Perry a slim packet of documents: a worn passport bearing the name Jared Parker with Perry's photo, boarding passes for the 7 p.m. flight to Paris, and a few other papers to smooth his passage through customs. Perry settled into the seat, the carrier wedged beside him, Fleming's muffled grumbles a low counterpoint of the city's hum. As the cab wove through Manhattan's congested streets, Perry's gaze drifted to the window, the blur of skyscrapers and neon signs a familiar backdrop. He wondered, as he always did in these vehicles, if this would be the ride that tested the cab's defenses: a stray bullet, an ambush, a bomb. The thought didn't unsettle him. Aside from Fleming, whose bulk pressed against the carrier's bars, and the driver, whose loyalty was to Onyx Sector, not him, there was no one in the car Perry cared about. Not even himself. 6. The TSA at John F. Kennedy International Airport gave Perry more grief about Fleming than Gore Inspectionman had suggested he'd face in Paris. The agents, clad in their navy blue uniforms, swarmed the dog carrier with a skepticism that bordered on theatrical, their gloved hands probing every seam, as if expecting to find a cache of explosives tucked beneath Fleming's water bowl. After a thorough inspection, complete with a handheld scanner and a barrage of questions about the bulldog's travel history, they were finally satisfied that Fleming was not a bomb, nor a cleverly disguised weapon of mass destruction. With a curt nod, a baggage handler in a fluorescent vest whisked the carrier away to the pressurized cargo hold, leaving Perry with a pang of guilt as he bent down to peer through the crate's bars. Fleming's jowls sagged, his dark eyes glinting with a sorrow that seemed to carry the weight of betrayal. "Don't fret, pal," Perry said, forcing a lightness into his voice. "You'll be strutting your stuff in Paris before you know it, charming the local poodles with that bulldog swagger." Fleming responded with a low, unconvinced grunt, his stubby tail motionless as the handler disappeared through a set of double doors. Perry straightened, adjusting the strap of his go bag, the weight of his vaulter's absence a subtle reminder of the arsenal awaiting him in Paris. With 40 minutes until boarding, he navigated the bustling terminal, its polished floors reflecting the glare of overhead lights and the kaleidoscope of travelers: businessmen in tailored suits, families hauling oversized suitcases, and backpackers clutching dog-eared guidebooks. His first-class ticket granted him access to the VIP lounge, a sleek oasis of muted grays and frosted glass tucked away from the terminal's chaos. Inside, the air was cool and scented with roasted coffee, a far cry from the stale tang of the main concourse. Perry settled into a plush leather armchair by a floor-to-ceiling window, the tarmac visible beyond, where planes taxied under the late afternoon sun. He ordered a vodka martini from the bartender, a balding man with a youthful face and a pin on his lapel that read Ryan. The urge to toss out Fleming's dog food joke, shaken not stirred, tugged at him, but he resisted, his mood too heavy for levity. The martini arrived, its surface shimmering with a faint sheen of vermouth, 3 olives speared on a sleek metal pick. Perry had grown up idolizing James Bond, devouring Ian Fleming's novels under the covers with a flashlight, dreaming of a life of glamour and danger. He'd never imagined those boyhood fantasies would twist into reality, landing him in a career that mirrored 007's in its stakes, if not its polish. But this was no cinematic romp. No pulp spy novel with a guaranteed happy ending. There were no last minute rescues, no escapes by the skin of his teeth. In the years since Onyx Sector recruited him from the NYPD, a move he'd made after dropping out of Columbia law to honor the thousands lost in the attacks that claimed his parents, Perry had seen enough to know that survival was a coin toss. The NYPD had been a stepping stone, a way to channel his grief into action, but Onyx had molded him into something else, a weapon, precise and expendable. His missions had involved far fewer gunfights than Bond's, but the body count was no less real. Killing was a part of the job, though Perry preferred the intimacy of his bare hands when possible. A chokehold, a snapped neck, the visceral feedback of flesh and bone. Guns, to him, were tools for intimidation, like when he tapped his Volter against the diner window to scare off those teens. They had their uses, of course, and he'd relied on them to escape tight spots, but he favored pistol whipping over shooting when time allowed. A bullet was too final, too distant, unless the clock was ticking. Tonight he was traveling light, his holster empty. An arsenal would be waiting at the Hotel de Londres, and navigating TSA with a dog had been challenge enough. Perry downed the martini in a single practiced gulp, the vodka's burn a fleeting distraction from the weight of Paris looming ahead. He glanced at his Rolex Submariner, the battered timepiece, a gift from Trina, and saw only 10 minutes had passed. Catching Ryan's eye, he signaled for another. The bartender's hands moved with practiced grace, the shaker clinking as he poured a fresh martini, its clarity catching the lounge's soft lighting. Perry nursed this one more slowly, the olives bobbing in the glass like tiny green buoys. He wasn't eager to board, not with 7.5 hours of confinement awaiting him in a first-class cabin that, no matter how plush, would feel like a cage. The flight would give his mind too much room to wander. To Trina, to the Hotel de Londres, to the honeymoon they'd spent tangled in each other's arms, oblivious to the world. Surviving the flight, he realized, was the difficult job he'd been dreading, not the mission itself. Paris would be its own crucible, every street a reminder of what he'd lost. After a few more minutes, he finished the second martini, the alcohol settling into a dull warmth in his chest. He slid a pair of crisp $20 bills across the polished bar. "Ryan, those were some damn fine martinis," he said, his voice rough but genuine. The bartender winked, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "Shaken, not stirred." Harry smiled at the coincidence and walked toward his gate. Almost immediately, a prickle of unease crawled up his spine, not the familiar ache of grief, but the sharp, professional instinct that had kept him alive through countless missions. As he wove through the crowd, his peripheral vision caught a face to his left, a crew-cut blond man, his features hard and unyielding like a statue carved from granite. Perry's training kicked in, his mind cataloging details. Black t-shirt stretched tight over a muscular frame, faded jeans, a purposeful stride. He kept walking, his pace casual, but glanced left again a minute later. The same face, closer now, moving through the sea of travelers. A third glance confirmed it. The blonde was tailing him, the distance between them shrinking. Perry's instincts screamed, his pulse quickening as he checked his watch. 10 minutes until boarding. He needed to act fast. Spotting a men's restroom ahead, its sign glowing above the crowd, he slipped inside, the door swinging shut behind him. The room was stark. White tiles, the faint smell of antiseptic. A single occupant washing his hands at the sink. Perry chose an empty stall, closing the door but leaving it unlocked. He stepped onto the toilet, crouching low to keep his head below the partition, his breath steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. 7. The restroom door swung open. Peering through the crack of the stall door, Perry saw the Dolph Lundgren clone step inside, the man's black tee seemingly painted onto his torso. For as busy as the terminal was, there had been only one other man in the room, and Dolph waited until he left, then began pushing open the stalls, making his way down toward Perry, who quietly moved as far back from the front as he could and lifted his foot. A moment later, the man reached his hiding place. As soon as the door opened about a foot, Perry kicked it with all his strength, the impact sending the man staggering backward, a metallic clank echoing as something, a handgun no doubt, hit the tile floor. The blonde had fewer qualms about smuggling a weapon through security, it seemed. Before the man could recover, Perry was on him, slipping behind and locking a chokehold around his thick neck. The blonde was a tower, 4 inches taller, 20 pounds heavier, and as strong as he looked, but even the toughest needed air. Within seconds, his struggles weakened, his face turning a very unhealthy shade of blue. "Talk," Perry hissed into his ear. The man, who had stopped struggling, made a weak motion with his arm, indicating he couldn't talk even if he wanted to. Perry loosened the hold slightly. The man's gun was accessible now that they were cozy on the floor. Perry grabbed it and pushed the muzzle hard into Dolph's temple. "I said talk." The man gasped for a moment, then managed to say, "Bite me." A relatively light tap on the brow with a gun opened a satisfying cut, sending a trickle of blood into Dolph's eye. Perry groaned, his patience fraying as he tightened his grip on the Glock, the metal cool against his palm. "If I wanted a comedian, the clubs in this town are full of them. Now tell me why you're following me, and maybe you'll live to annoy someone else." "I don't like your shoes," the blond man rasped, his voice strained but defiant, a smirk flickering across his bloodied face despite the gun pressed to his temple. Perry hit him again, harder this time. "Oh, you have made a grave mistake, my friend. I don't need footwear advice from uneducated louts whose idea of a good time is to play follow the leader in airports. You can call me names and insult my manhood, but do not, I repeat, do not speak ill of my shoes." A third thud with the gun was a little too vigorous, and the man's body relaxed as he slipped into unconsciousness. "Well, damn," Perry said. There wasn't time to revive the thug and press him further. Voices, male, agitated, sounded just outside the restroom door, accompanied by the scuff of shoes on the terminal's polished floor. Perry sprang to his feet, his movements fluid despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. He grabbed the metal trash can from the corner, its contents reeking of discarded coffee cups and crumpled napkins, and wedged it diagonally under the door handle, buying himself a few precious seconds. With a quick swipe of his sleeve, he wiped the Glock clean of prints, the blood and sweat smearing across the fabric, and dropped the weapon into a second trash receptacle by the sinks, its clatter muffled by a pile of paper towels. The door rattled, someone cursing loudly on the other side, the handle jerking against the makeshift barricade. Perry propped the unconscious blonde on a toilet, the man's bulk slumping awkwardly, his head lolling to one side. He pulled the stall door shut, the latch clicking softly, then yanked the trash can free and opened the restroom door. An irate man in a rumpled business suit stood on the other side, his face flushed with impatience. Perry offered a meek smile, his posture slouched to sell the act. "Sorry," he said. "Shy bladder." The man barely glanced at him, shoving past with a muttered curse and disappearing into the restroom. Perry hurried toward his gate, his go bag bouncing against his shoulder, the terminal's chaos swallowing him once more. He reached the gate just as an attractive brunette at the podium pressed the button on her microphone, her voice smooth and practiced. "We now invite our first-class passengers to board Flight 412 to Paris." By the time Perry settled into his first-class seat, the plush leather cradling his frame, his heart rate had steadied, the adrenaline ebbing like a receding tide. The cabin was a cocoon of luxury, polished wood accents, ambient lighting, and a faint scent of lavender from the complimentary amenity kits. He fastened his seatbelt, the click grounding him, and breathed a sigh of relief as the jet engines whined to full power, the plane surging down the runway. The angry man in the restaurant hadn't found the blonde, Dolph, as Perry had dubbed him, snoozing on the toilet, and no one else would connect an unconscious thug to Jared Parker, first class passenger. He waited for the seatbelt sign to dim, then flagged the flight attendant, a poised woman with a sleek blonde bun, and ordered a vodka martini. He turned to the window, the millions of lights outlining metropolitan New York twinkling below as the plane climbed, the city shrinking into a glittering mosaic. He took a sip of the martini, the vodka sharp but lacking the crisp perfection of Ryan's mix at the lounge. It was close enough, though, for rock and roll. "All right, Paris, you monster," he whispered, his breath fogging the glass. "I'm coming." 7 hours and 20 minutes is an awfully long time when you don't want to think. For a while, Perry occupied his thoughts with the attacker, turning the encounter over in his mind, piecing together the fragments. Why would anyone have known he was going to be in the airport in the Delta terminal? Why had Dolph followed him? Who had tipped him off? Ryan's offhand, shaken, not stirred comment at the lounge replayed, the bartender's knowing glance suddenly sinister in hindsight. Had Ryan made him, pegged him as more than a wealthy traveler, and alerted the blonde? It could be a fluke, a scorpion operative in the right place at the right time, or something worse. Someone had known Perry was flying to Paris tonight. The shoe insult was a long shot, but Perry wasn't ruling it out. His Ferragamos were impeccable after all. Whatever the truth, Ryan was no longer his favorite bartender. The incident underscored a brutal reality. Perry could never let his guard down, never relax. Two versions of Perry Hall coexisted within him, locked in a constant struggle. One was the broken man whose life had lost all meaning, drowning in grief and vodka. The other was the killing machine, honed by Onyx into a predator who never missed a trick. He needed to stay the latter, but as the adrenaline from the restroom faded, the former crept in, heavy and suffocating. He caught the flight attendant's eye, then held his empty martini glass up and wiggled it. While she was making him another drink, he opened the storage compartment next to his spacious seat and set his go bag on the wooden countertop. He opened it and took out Trina's picture. To this day, he could not believe any human being could be so beautiful. The girders of the iconic French tower in the background reminded him that he would soon be in very nearly the same location he'd stood when he snapped the photo. Had it really been 3 years? One day tended to melt into the next when he wasn't working, and he'd only been given 3 assignments during that time. The last had been 10 months earlier, and had ended successfully, even if a tad too spectacularly for Moore's taste. Perry had located a pack of scorpion terrorists operating in Singapore and locked them in a lovely single-story bungalow on the waterfront, which he proceeded to blow sky high with enough C4 to destroy a city block. He had pushed the trigger button from a point so close he was thrown backward through the air, his hair and eyebrows singed by the heat. The two prior missions had also showcased Perry's ruthlessness and complete absence of concern for his own welfare, which was why Moore used him only sparingly and only when the mission dripped with danger. The past 10 months of idleness had gnawed at him, the silence amplifying his demons. He told himself he wasn't a complete wreck, that the blackouts were just self-medication, a way to numb the memories when coping failed. But in the brutal clarity of a transatlantic flight, with nothing but the hum of the engines and the weight of Trina's photo, he admitted the truth. His ability to cope was crumbling, eroding with every empty bottle and sleepless night. As the sun rose over the Atlantic, its golden light piercing the cabin windows to signal they were an hour from Paris, Perry heeded the flight attendant's gentle suggestion and stopped drinking. He'd tried to sleep, But his mind refused to quiet, replaying the restroom fight, Trina's smile, the looming specter of Paris. He'd looked at her photo 59 times, each glance a fresh wound. Closing his eyes, he made a silent vow. When the plane touched down at Charles de Gaulle, he'd be all business, the killing machine in full control. Paris could try to break him, but Eagle would not falter. 8. Perry stood before a half wall at Charles de Gaulle Airport's custom area, the barrier separating him from a French officer in an ostentatiously ornate uniform, all gold braid and polished buttons, and the crate containing Fleming. The officer, a rail-thin man with a weak chin, receding hairline, and a perpetually sour expression, wielded a pin light with the gravitas of a surgeon, shining it into the crate's mesh door as if expecting to uncover contraband hidden in Fleming's jowls. He'd already scrutinized the dog's paperwork 3 times, flipping through the vaccination records and microchip certification with the deliberateness that bordered on performative. Finally, he turned his attention to Fleming himself, his lips curling in disdain. "Zut! Bulldog Anglais!" he exclaimed, as if the breed were a personal affront. Perry's patience, already worn thin by the transatlantic flight and the lingering unease from the JFK incident, was fraying. "Yes, an English bulldog," he said, his tone flat, his arms crossed over his go-bag's strap. The officer pivoted to Perry, flashing what was meant to be a charming smile, but landed as a smirk, begging for a fist to wipe it away. "We do not get on well with the English," he quipped, his English clipped with a heavy French accent. From within the crate, Fleming let out a low, grumbling growl, the sound vibrating through the metal bars. Perry leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "He doesn't seem excited to meet you either. Can I have my dog, please?" With a practiced nonchalance, Perry placed a crisp €100 note on the shelf atop the half wall, the bill's edges sharp against the worn wood. The officer's gaze flicked to it, his smirk faltering for a split second. He cast a quick, furtive glance around the bustling customs area, travelers hauling luggage, officers stamping passports, then snatched the bill with a magician's sleight of hand, tucking it into his pocket. "Franco-English relations have improved considerably," he said, his tone suddenly magnanimous as he unlatched the crate's door and waved Perry forward. "Diplomacy wins again," Perry muttered under his breath, crouching to coax Fleming out. The bulldog emerged with a disgruntled huff, his stubby legs wobbling after hours of confinement, but his dark eyes brightened at the sight of his owner. From customs, Perry navigated the terminal's chaos to a taxi stand outside, where a line of cabs idled under a gray Parisian sky, the air thick with diesel fumes and the faint sweetness of fresh croissants from a nearby kiosk. He secured a cab and gave the driver the address for the Hôtel de Londres, the words bitter on his tongue. His jaw clenched as he settled into the back seat, the leather worn and faintly sticky, and proceeded to give Fleming a well-deserved belly rub. The dog flopped onto his side with a contented moan, his rolls of skin quivering under Barry's fingers, drawing a curious glance from the driver in the rearview mirror. "American?" the driver asked, his English halting but friendly, his mustache twitching as he grinned. "Mm-hmm," Perry replied, his focus on Fleming's midsection. "Your dog he enjoys, yes?" "There are few things that get him excited," Perry said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "A good belly rub is one, and pretty French poodles are the other." They are overrated as lovers," the driver exclaimed, his laughter booming in the cab's cramped interior. Paris traffic was marginally less infuriating than New York's, but it still crawled, the city's narrow streets clogged with scooters, delivery vans, and tourists gawking at the facades. The driver, a wiry man with a knack for weaving through gaps, promised a shortcut, a phrase that usually signaled a scenic, wallet-draining detour. To Perry's surprise, the man delivered, navigating a series of back streets lined with ivy-draped buildings and quaint bistros, their chalkboard menus advertising delicious-sounding fare. 30 minutes after leaving de Gaulle, the cab pulled up to the Hotel de Londres, its elegant stone exterior and wrought iron balconies, a painful echo of Paris' past. Perry stepped into the lobby, Fleming's leash in one hand, his go bag slung over his shoulder. The space was a blend of classic Parisian charm and modern luxury, polished marble floors, a crystal chandelier casting prisms across the walls, and the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. At the reception desk, a well-groomed woman in a tailored navy blazer greeted him, her gold name tag identifying her as Marie. Her eyes swept over him, lingering on his rumpled jacket and the bulldog at his side, a thorough appraisal disguised as professional courtesy before she turned to her computer terminal. "Reservation for Jared Parker," Perry said, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. "Ah, yes, Monsieur Parker," Marie replied, her French accent softening the edges of her English. "Your suite is ready. You will be interested in our pet care services, no? We have groomers and walkers available." "Yes, thank you," Perry said, glancing down at Fleming, who was sniffing the base of a potted fern with intense curiosity. "Fleming doesn't require much in the way of grooming, but I'll be very busy and he will need some walking." "Of course," Marie said, her fingers dancing across the keyboard. "Simply dial 312 on your telephone to set up a schedule. Oh, and I have a message for you." She slid a small, cream-colored envelope across the counter, Parker written on the front in precise, elegant script. "Merci," Perry said, pocketing the envelope without opening it. "Can you have Fleming's crate stored for me? He's had more than enough of it for now." "Of course." Marie rang an old-fashioned desk bell twice, once with a single, resonant tone, summoning a bellman in a burgundy uniform, and once with 3 staccato rings, calling a man in a neatly pressed, powder-blue jumpsuit. The latter collected the crate with a brisk efficiency, handing Perry a claim receipt before disappearing through a service door. The bellhop, a young man with slicked back hair and a practiced smile, eyed Perry's go bag, clearly not expecting to carry it. Instead, he reached for Fleming's leash, his fingers brushing the worn leather. As they stepped into the elevator, its brass accents gleaming under the soft light, the bellhop pressed the button for the 14th floor. The door slid shut with a whisper, and he turned to Perry, his demeanor shifting from polite to purposeful. "My name is Pete, Monsieur Eagle. Your weapons and briefing file are in the nightstand to the left of your bed. The handguns are a Glock 40 for your holster and a .22 revolver for your pocket. The briefing is on a secure flash drive. The password is Napoleon. Case sensitive, of course. The note you received will be from Duchamp. He is no doubt letting you know where and when to meet him. He will be your chief contact in Paris, though I will provide what assistance I can." "Thank you, Pete. Excellent work," Perry said, his tone clipped but appreciative, his mind already cataloging the details. A Glock 40 was reliable, heavy-hitting. The .22 revolver, discreet and deadly in close quarters. Duchamp's involvement suggested a high-stakes operation. Onyx Sector's Paris network was tight, and Duchamp was a seasoned operative, not a desk jockey. The elevator doors opened, and a young couple, their arms entwined and laughter bubbling, pushed past them onto the lift. Perry stepped out, Pete trailing with Fleming's leash. The bellhop launched into a cheerful monologue in French about Parisian attractions, the Louvre's hidden gems, the best jazz bars on the left bank, his voice loud enough to carry, a perfect cover for their earlier exchange. Perry nodded absently, his focus on the hallway stretching before him. His suite was to the right, a solitary door at the corridor's end, isolated from the 2 rooms facing each other to the left. He was grateful for the distance. The couple's giddy energy suggested noises he'd rather not hear. The Hotel de Londres, for all its opulence, silk wallpaper, antique furnishings, had thin walls, a fact he and Trina had learned during their honeymoon. The memory surfaced unbidden. The disapproving scowl of the blue-haired woman in the adjacent room contrasted by their husband's amused, knowing grin. Pete slid the key card into the door slot, the quiet beep accompanied by the LED on the latch flickering from red to green. He pushed the door open with a practiced ease, leading Fleming into the suite, the bulldog's claws clicking softly on the polished hardwood floor. The suite was a study in understated elegance, a spacious bedroom bathed in natural light from a wide terrace door, a compact office with a sleek mahogany desk, and a kitchenette equipped with a gleaming espresso machine and a mini bar stocked with crystal glassware. Perry's eyes swept the room, cataloging exits and sightlines out of habit, but Fleming had other priorities. The dog trotted to a plush burgundy cushion thoughtfully placed at the base of the king-sized bed, its velvet surface embroidered with the hotel's crest. With a contented huff, he flopped onto it, his jowls spreading like pancake batter. Perry raised an eyebrow at Pete, a silent question in his expression. The bellman, his burgundy uniform crisp despite the morning's hustle, flashed a warm smile. Monsieur Moore let us know you would be bringing your companion, so I took the liberty, he said, his Dutch-accented French lending a soft cadence to the words. He approached Fleming, reaching into his pocket to produce a small, bone-shaped biscuit, its surface flecked with herbs. Fleming's eyes lit up, his stubby tail wagging furiously as he snatched the treat, crunching it with gusto. That's very thoughtful, Perry said, genuine gratitude softening his tone. He pulled a 50-euro note from his wallet, the bill crisp and vibrant, and offered it to Pete. The bellman waved it off, his expression earnest. There is no one to see. The pretense is not necessary. It wasn't pretense, Perry insisted, tucking the note back into his pocket. I'm genuinely grateful for you thinking about Fleming. He has already thanked me with his tail, such as it is, Pete said, chuckling as he gestured to the dog's enthusiastic wagging. Perry laughed, the sound rare and fleeting, and extended his hand instead. Pete shook it firmly, his grip steady and reassuring. You have much work, the bellman said, his tone shifting to a quiet seriousness. I'll leave you. If you require anything, call the front desk and ask for me. Once Pete had gone, the door clicking shut behind him, Perry crossed to the bedroom, the weight of the mission settling over him like a fog. He sat on the left side of the bed, the mattress yielding under his weight, and opened the nightstand's door, its hinges silent. Inside, as promised, were two handguns. A Glock 40, its matte black finish equipped with a suppressor, and a compact .22 revolver, perfect for concealment. A modified shoulder holster, its leather worn but meticulously maintained, lay beside them, designed to accommodate the Glock's attachment. Perry slipped on the harness, the straps familiar against his chest, and slid the Glock into place, its weight a grounding presence. He adjusted it for comfort, ensuring it would remain invisible beneath his jacket, then tucked the .22 into his pocket, its small size ideal for close encounters. Standing, he checked his reflection in the full-length mirror by the wardrobe, nodding in satisfaction at the seamless fit. He removed his blazer, hanging it carefully on the bedpost. Tearing open the note, he read, Café Marseille, 13:15 hours, Henri. Henri was Michel Duchamp's cover name, a pseudonym Perry would use in public, though he might also call him Lion, Duchamp's code name in secure settings. The handwriting was precise, the ink a deep indigo that suggested a fountain pen, a detail that spoke to Duchamp's meticulous nature. Looking at his watch, Perry realized he hadn't adjusted it to local time. He spotted an alarm clock on the opposite nightstand, its digital display glowing 10 o'clock. Resetting his watch, he stretched out on the bed, the crisp linens cool against his back. Relief washed over him. He had over 3 hours before his meeting with Duchamp at the Café Marseille, a cozy spot he vaguely remembered from his honeymoon, its red awning and wicker chairs, a staple of Parisian street life. His eyes drifted to the wet bar in the corner, its glass shelves gleaming with bottles of Grey Goose, Macallan, and a tempting array of French wines. The urge to pour a drink tugged at him, a familiar siren call, but he resisted. Clarity was paramount now. This mission left no room for self medication. The bed was comfortable and he drifted off, later awakened by the alarm he'd set when he adjusted the watch. It was 12:15. He still had an hour, but the Marseille was a dozen or so blocks from the hotel and he wanted to walk. A rather noxious smell from the base of the bed reminded him that he needed to make arrangements for Fleming. Walking across the room to the small table holding the phone, he said, "That's how you react after one French dog treat? I think the food here may be a little rich for you." Fleming rolled on his side and, in response to the insult, added more fragrance to the air. "Oh, you stink," Perry said, pulling back the curtain and opening the sliding door that led to the terrace outside the bedroom. The instant he did, something whistled past his ear and thudded into the opposite wall. He instinctively dropped to the floor and turned to see the bullet hole. It was large, the caliber substantial, likely a .308 or higher. It would have turned his head into a Jackson Pollock painting had it connected. Peering out the sliding glass door, he saw several buildings from which the sniper could have nested, but didn't see a shooter, or even an open window or terrace door. He reached toward the slider with his foot and, catching his toe on the frame, pulled it shut. "I guess I'd rather deal with your farts," he told Fleming, who blinked at him with mild indifference, though they're only marginally less deadly. Still crouched, Perry crawled along a path that minimized his exposure to the terrace, reaching for the curtain and yanking it closed with a sharp tug. The heavy fabric blocked out the daylight, plunging the room into a dim glow. Confident the sniper wouldn't waste ammunition on blind shots, he stood, brushing dust from his knees. "Well, someone knows we're here," he said to Fleming, his voice grim as he grabbed the phone and dialed 312, the number Marie had given for pet services. In a brisk 2-minute call, he arranged a feeding and walking schedule for Fleming. The concierge assured him it could be arranged, her tone professional but warm. Perry set the phone down, his mind racing. A gunman at JFK and now a sniper in Paris, mere hours after his arrival. The mission was shaping up to be a gauntlet, each step laced with danger. He glanced at Fleming, who had returned to dozing, oblivious to the bullet hole in the wall. "Fun-filled trip, pal," Perry muttered. "And we're just getting started." 9. The 12-block walk from the hotel to the outdoor cafe was pleasant, and Perry found that, despite his typical dark mood and the recent brush with death, he was enjoying it. Every city had its own distinctive aroma, and Paris was no exception. Perry always thought it a heady blend of the Seine's brackish water, tinged with moss and thyme, and, inexplicably, the crisp scent of fresh linen drying in the sun. In the autumn, a subtle layer of decay from the golden leaves carpeting the boulevards added a melancholic note, whispering of seasons past. Whatever it was, it seemed to say adieu, while actually meaning bonjour. Paris might be hailed as the city of lights or the city of love, but for Perry, it was the city of nostalgia, a place that stirred a longing for centuries he'd never lived, making him ache for eras of gaslit streets and horse-drawn carriages. It was a city that beckoned to the heart and imagination like no other, weaving a spell of wistful enchantment. The Café Marseille, tucked along a bustling stretch of the Boulevard Saint-Germain, was a quintessential Parisian haunt, almost comically stereotypical with its starched white tablecloths, wicker chairs, and woven baskets brimming with crusty baguettes. The air carried the rich aroma of espresso and buttery croissants, mingling with the faint tang of cigarette smoke from a nearby patron. Perry's sharp eyes scanned the crowded patio and locked onto Michel Duchamp, seated at a corner table beneath a striped awning, sipping a chocolat l'ancien. The steaming cup of thick, velvety chocolate was a nod to tradition, its surface dusted with a faint sheen of cocoa. Perry and Duchamp had history, though not in France. They'd stood back to back in a sweltering Malaysian jungle 3 years prior during a brutal firefight that had left their team decimated. Perry had picked off a sniper with a clean shot through the man's scope, saving Duchamp's life just as the gunman had drawn a bead on his head. Duchamp spotted him approaching, his lean frame rising from the chair with a warm smile creasing his weathered face, carrying the weight of too many close calls. "Jared, mon ami," he called, his voice rich with genuine affection. "I've thought of you often these past months." "As I have you, Henri," Perry replied, matching the warmth. They embraced, a quick but firm clasp, and as they did, Perry felt Duchamp's hand slip deftly into his jacket pocket. The subtle weight of a small device settled there, a practiced move executed with the finesse of a seasoned operative. They parted, and Perry's hand brushed the pocket, confirming the object's presence without breaking his stride. A waiter, clad in a crisp black vest and bow tie, approached the table, his expression politely neutral. Perry pointed to Duchamp's drink. "One of those," he said. "Very good, monsieur," the waiter replied in accented English, his polished shoes clicking the pavement as he retreated. Moments later he returned, placing the steaming cup before Perry with a flourish before melting back into the cafe's bustle. Duchamp leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, barely audible over the clink of cutlery and the hum of nearby conversations. "Things have gotten worse," he said, his eyes flicking to the device in Perry's pocket. "I gave you a GPS tracker showing you a signal from Bart's chip." Perry's brow furrowed, but he kept his tone steady. "How is that worse? It could mean he's alive." Duchamp's expression darkened, his fingers tightening around his cup. "It could just as easily mean the body part with the chip is no longer connected to the rest of him. The tracker Amanda was using also transmitted her location, and its last signal came from an alley in a seedier district, mostly warehouses, derelict factories, and the kind of places where rats outnumber the people." Perry took a slow sip of the chocolate, its richness coating his tongue as he processed the information. "Where is this signal in relation to the alley?" "Much closer to the city center," Duchamp replied, his voice grim. "It's a block of apartments not far from the Place de la Bastille, in a neighborhood of narrow streets and old stone buildings." "Why do you think they cut him up?" Perry asked, his mind already racing through gruesome possibilities. Duchamp's jaw tightened. "When Amanda's signal went dead, we sent someone to investigate. The alley where her tracker last broadcast had no access points, no doors, no windows, no way she could have slipped through. For the chip to have been broadcasting from there, either Bart was there or just the part with the chip was. If he'd been there, fully intact, I mean, we think Amanda would have been far less likely to have been taken by surprise. She was too sharp for that." "Where on Bart was the chip?" Perry asked, his stomach curdling a little at the thought of what was being suggested. "His foot." "Yikes," Perry muttered, picturing the grim mechanics of such a severance. "Easy enough to separate." "Exactement," Duchamp agreed, his voice heavy with distaste. Perry leaned back, the wicker chair creaking under his weight. "Forgive me for being dense, but that still doesn't seem like the situation has gotten much worse. More already suspected they were both gone." Duchamp's eyes narrowed, his gaze darting briefly to the passers-by before returning to Perry. "It's the bigger picture that's distressing. The fact that the chip is now broadcasting from a densely populated part of the city suggests that our initial assessment was wrong. The nuke isn't being smuggled out of the country. It's here in Paris, and this apartment block might be where it's being held." Perry's grip on his cup tightened, the porcelain warm against his palm. "Probably doesn't matter much where it is," he said, his voice low and edged with gallows humor, we don't find it, there won't be much of Paris left wherever it detonates. The Seine will be glowing for a century. Duchamp nodded gravely, his lips a thin line. Oui, true enough. All right, Perry said, setting the cup down with a soft clink. I'll head to the source of the signal and see what I can find. Do we have it pinpointed? We do, Duchamp replied, and that's the next part of the problem. The building is owned by and is the home of Pierre Montmartre. Perry frowned, the name sparking a flicker of recognition. I have heard the name. Duchamp's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. Montmartre would be disappointed if you hadn't. He maintains a high profile, appallingly rich, disgustingly powerful, a titan in real estate, oil, and cutting-edge technology. His name is on half the skyscrapers in La Défense, and we're quite certain he's more than a little connected to Scorpion. That last part, of course, he doesn't broadcast, but he hasn't tried hard to hide it either. A man like him thrives on the edge of shadows. Perry's mind churned, piecing together the implications. Wouldn't the destruction of Paris be a little counterproductive, him being such a magnet and all? Duchamp's expression hardened. His enterprises span the globe, New York, Dubai, Shanghai, not just Paris. But I think his ties to Scorpion suggests the terror this would cause outweighs any buildings or businesses he might lose here. Fear is a currency, and Scorpion trades in it heavily. Perry mused, his cynicism rising like bile. Probably pretty well insured anyway. Man like that doesn't bet without a safety net. Duchamp let out a short, bitter laugh, the sound swallowed by the cafe's ambient noise. You haven't changed, Jared. Still seen the world's underbelly first. Perry took another sip of his chocolate. I'm not really much of a chocolate guy, but this isn't bad, he admitted, the faintest quirk of a smile tugging at his lips. Duchamp's hazel eyes glinted with mischief as he leaned back in his wicker chair, the striped awning above casting dappled shadows across his weathered face. A hint of Grand Marnier, mon ami, to get your blood pumping, he said with a grin. What do you say in America? Don't leave home without it? Perry chuckled, the sound low and dry as he set the cup down on the starched white tablecloth. I was wondering what that orange flavor was. Should have known, you being such a lover of the finer things. Duchamp's grin faded, his expression sobering as he swirled the remnants of his drink. If we don't find what we're looking for, there'll be no more finer things for either of us, unless you fancy the cuisine in paradise. His tone was light, but his eyes betrayed the gravity of the stakes, the specter of a nuclear detonation lurking behind his words. Perry's jaw tightened, his gaze drifting to the bustling Boulevard Saint-Germain, where Parisians wove through the autumn air with the effortless grace of a city that had seen centuries of turmoil and still stood. Not sure that's the restaurant where we'll be dining, he said, his voice edged with grim humor. Duchamp let out a soft laugh, but it was tinged with unease. Come now, Jared, we fight the good fight, no? It's not our motives I worry about, Perry countered, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. It's our methods. Too many lines crossed, too many bodies left behind. Duchamp's expression hardened, his voice dropping to a near whisper. We do what we must. You know this as well as I. Perry exhaled sharply through his nose, the truth of Duchamp's words settling like a stone in his chest. He pushed back his chair, the wicker creaking under his weight, and stood. On that note, I should get moving. Clock's ticking. Duchamp nodded, his movements measured as he rose to his feet. Very well. The address is in your pocket, but I'd check the tracker to see if there's any movement. It's programmed to update in real time. Not likely it's moving on its own, Perry said, his tone flat, if you're correct about Bart's, condition. But I'll give it a look when I'm closer. Duchamp extended his hand, his grip firm and steady as they shook. Depending on what you find, the device can also call for backup. I'd come with you now, but... He hesitated, his eyes scanning the cafe's patio with the practiced paranoia of a man who'd survived too many ambushes. I'm not sure I haven't been made. Perry's gaze followed Duchamp's, sweeping the crowd for any lingering stares or too casual loiterers. Better to hang back then, he said, his voice low. Besides, what's the worst that can happen? 10. Paris is a city of 41 square miles, not a small parcel of land. And although it is capably served by various forms of public transit, many people choose to walk to their destinations. Perry always assumed it was because between any given points A and B there was so much to discover. Today, however, as he walked toward Boulevard Henri IV, he noticed many people, especially the couples, seemed far more interested in each other than their surroundings. It was an observation he wished he hadn't made. His decision to walk was based upon a gut feeling that the distance between the cafe and the address Duchamp has slipped into his pocket might somehow give him some sort of clue, something, anything to give him direction. He didn't like the possibility of tracking down a foot, and would have liked to come across a better lead. As he moved briskly along Rue Saint Jacques toward the Sorbonne, he found himself experiencing the same uneasy feeling he'd had at JFK. Looking around as nonchalantly and tourist like as possible, he tried to single out any faces that seemed to be within his sight upon multiple checks. After checking his fellow pedestrians for a third time, he noticed one person, a younger man with a mop of curly brown hair that spiraled upwards like an inverted ice cream cone. The man wore sunglasses, unwarranted on a cloudy fall day, and seemed to be keeping a constant distance at Perry's 5 o'clock. To test the theory, Perry slowed his pace. The man slowed as well. Perry crossed the street. So did the man. There was no doubt left in Jared/Perry's mind. His cover had been blown wide open. If the sniper's bullet hadn't been proof enough, there was the lingering shadow at JFK's baggage claim, and now this new tale trailing him through Paris's autumnal streets. The situation was unraveling faster than he'd feared, each incident a thread pulled from the fragile fabric of his anonymity. Whoever was orchestrating this, Montmartre, Scorpion, or some unseen player, knew exactly who he was and where he was headed. He mulled his options as a fourth glance over his shoulder confirmed the curly-haired man was still there. The street teemed with life. Vendors hawking chestnuts, couples whispering under umbrellas, a busker strumming a melancholy tune on an accordion. It was too crowded for a confrontation in the open, too many eyes to witness what Perry might have to do. He scanned the surroundings, his gaze snagging on a small chapel nestled between a patisserie and a tobacco shop. Its weathered stone facade and arched wooden door promised solitude. Not ideal, roughing someone up in a house of worship felt like tempting fate, even for a man like Perry. But if this was indeed the third attempt on him since leaving his Brooklyn apartment, he needed answers, and he'd get them, sacred ground or not. Perry quickened his pace, weaving through a knot of tourists snapping photos of a fountain, then darted to his right. His hand closed around the chapel's iron door handle, cool and slick with condensation, and he yanked the heavy wooden door open. Without looking back, he slipped inside, the door creaking shut behind him with a soft thud that echoed in the dim interior. A quick glance revealed the chapel was, as he'd hoped, deserted. The space was modest but ornate, steeped in the solemnity of centuries. Faded paintings of biblical scenes, Christ's agony in Gethsemane, the Last Supper, adorned the walls, their colors muted by time. Crucifixes hung at every turn, some carved from dark wood, others gleaming silver, catching the faint light filtering through stained glass windows depicting saints with mournful eyes. The air smelled of wax and old incense, a faint trace of mildew lingering beneath. Near the entrance, a small table held a marble font of holy water, its surface rippling faintly, and a pair of heavy brass candlesticks, each topped with a flickering taper. Perry blew out one candle, the acrid puff of smoke curling upward, and lifted the candlestick, its weight reassuring in his grip. He stepped to the side of the door, pressing himself against the cool stone wall, and raised the makeshift weapon above his head. Seconds later, the door creaked open, and a head crowned with spiraling brown curls poked tentatively inside, the man's sunglasses glinting in the chapel's muted light. Perry brought the candlestick down with a swift, brutal arc, the brass connecting with the man's temple with a dull thunk. The tail staggered, a pained grunt escaping his lips, as Perry seized his collar and dragged him inside. With a quick motion, he jammed the candlestick through the door handles, its sturdy frame ensuring no stray worshippers, or accomplices, would interrupt. The man was dazed but conscious, slumped against the chapel floor, his sunglasses askew, revealing bloodshot eyes wide with shock. Blood trickled from a gash above his brow, matting his curls. Perry crouched low, his face inches from the man's, his voice a low growl. "Time to talk. Who are you with? Why were you following me?" To Perry's surprise, the man's response came in English, laced with a drawl that belonged in an Alabama diner, not a Parisian chapel. "Screw you. I ain't telling you nothing," he spat, his voice thick with defiance despite the tremor in it. Perry's lips curled into a cold, cheerful smile, the kind that never reached his eyes. "Oh, how convenient. There's this new torture technique I've been dying to try. The guy who taught it to me said it hurt so bad you'll probably wet your pants right before spilling everything I want to know. Hope that pea coat isn't dry clean only." The man's eyes widened slightly, but he remained silent. "Thanks for being such a good sport," Perry chirped. "Let's see how well this works." He rolled the man onto his stomach and sat heavily on his back. The rapid application of Perry's weight on his upper body forced the air from his lungs, causing him to let out a whooshing moan. As he opened his mouth in an unwise attempt to breathe, Perry hooked a pinky into each side of his mouth, pulling back so hard the flesh almost tore, and producing an enormous, horrifying smile. At the same time, Perry dug his forefingers into each eye while applying enormous pressure on both temples with his thumbs. The combination of the three assaults to such tender areas at once was excruciating, and the man began to scream. "Shush now," Perry whispered, leaning close, his breath hot against the man's ear. "You're in church. Show a little damn respect. Who sent you to follow me? Oh, and before you answer, I should probably tell you I haven't gotten to the part where I hurt you yet." The man's scream faltered into a choked sob, his words garbled by Perry's fingers in his mouth, but intelligible enough. "No, no more!" "Tell me then," Perry snapped. The man did not answer immediately, leading Perry to engage in a demonstration of dexterity that would have turned even the most accomplished violinist green with envy. Placing a middle finger in each of his victim's nostrils, Perry pulled them in opposite directions. "I could tear your face in half, if you'd like," Perry said, his tone conversational, almost bored. "Or you can tell me what I want to know. Up to you, no pressure." In direct contradiction to this last remark, the man's screams intensified, and Perry let out a brief, involuntary chortle. "Actually, I guess there's quite a bit of pressure, isn't there?" In a voice shredded with pain, the tail choked out the word Montmarche. The French name sounded almost comical in his impeded drawl. This was unwelcome news. Not only had he been made, but the man Duchamp had told him about, only minutes before, the man whose building into which he would probably have to insert himself was already onto him. The entire time Perry had been sitting on his back, the man had kicked and writhed, trying to knock off his tormentor. But now his body went slack as the excruciating pain drove him into unconsciousness. Perry stood up and looked around. There was a small closet to the left of the entry in the nave of the chapel, and he dragged the man inside by his unruly hair. A choir boy's robe was hanging there, and he took the golden cord that served as a belt and securely tied his victim's hands and feet. Pulling a priest's fascia from another hanger, he shoved it roughly into the man's already damaged mouth. By the way, Perry muttered to the unconscious figure, your haircut is ridiculous. Like a poodle got lost in a windstorm. Satisfied the man was no longer a threat, Perry closed the closet door with a soft click, retrieved the candlestick from the door handles, and set it back on the table, its candle still smoldering faintly. Then he stepped back outside. The street was still alive with Parisians, oblivious to the violence that had unfolded mere feet away. Perry moved with renewed vigor, eager to reach the apartment block owned by Pierre Montmarche. If the man was already sending out a welcome wagon, the sooner Perry took him down, the better. 11. The Maison Montmartre loomed, a titan of architecture that dominated the city block with an almost regal arrogance. 7 conjoined buildings, their fronts painted a brilliant white, gleamed like a 7-story beacon. The structure's pristine exterior seemed to pulse with a quiet menace, as if it knew the secrets it harbored and dared anyone to uncover them. Intricate cornices and wrought iron balconies adorned its upper floors, lending an air of old-world elegance that clashed with the modern menace Perry associated with its owner. For a full 30 minutes, Perry lingered across the boulevard, his lean frame half hidden in the shadow of a chestnut tree, its leaves drifting to the pavement in golden spirals. He studied the entryway, a grand double door of polished oak framed by marble columns. The corner of the building jutted out like a castle turret, crowned with a blue-domed roof that tapered to a sharp point, glinting faintly under the overcast sky. Perry's gut told him Montmarche's lair, his private offices or penthouse, lay beneath that dome, a king surveying his empire from the top floor. Despite the building's ominous aura, it was undeniably beautiful, set against a tree-lined boulevard where sycamores swayed gently. Above the double doorway was a tasteful sign bearing the words Maison Montmartre in gold lettering. Below the sign stood a formidable-looking individual in a dark blue suit that, to Perry's trained eye, showed a slight bulge in the same place his pale gray sport coat did, right where the shoulder holster's business section lay. The man's smoothly shaved head added a Luciferian balefulness to his already imposing appearance. Perry shifted his attention to the bustling street, his sharp eyes scanning the flow of pedestrians, office workers in crisp suits, tourists clutching guidebooks, an old woman pulling a cart of vegetables. He needed a distraction, something to draw the guard away from the door long enough for him to slip inside unnoticed. The crowd offered plenty of bodies, but no clear opportunity, and for several minutes he saw nothing he could exploit. Then, as if the fates had taken pity on him, a trio of young boys appeared on the opposite side of the boulevard, loitering near a shuttered newsstand. They were 12 or 13, their school uniforms rumpled and ties askew, clearly cutting class. To Perry, their defiance was a gift, a spark of youthful rebellion he could ignite. He crossed the street with a casual stride, his hands in his pockets to mask the tension coiling in his muscles. As he approached, the boys eyed him warily, their postures stiffening as if they might bolt. Perry raised a hand, his voice calm but firm, calling out in fluent French, "Who wants 10 euros?" They stopped in their tracks. The tallest, a gangly ginger with bad acne, spoke up. "What for? Nothing freaky." Perry's lips twitched, a faint smile breaking through his stoic mask. "No, I just want you to break a window." The words sparked a round of grins, as he'd known they would. The universal delinquent streak of truants was a reliable ally, especially in the restless early days of a school term. The boys exchanged glances, their excitement palpable. "Do we have to get inside?" asked a shorter, stocky boy with dirty blonde hair, filthy in the literal sense, streaked with grime as if he'd rolled through a gutter. "Nope," Perry replied, his tone easy. "Just throw a rock straight enough and hard enough to smash it." Where? The redhead demanded, his skepticism giving way to intrigue. Perry pointed across the street to the Maison Montmartre, its white facade gleaming like a challenge. The boys' grins faltered, their faces paling in unison as they shook their heads, a chorus of horror. No! Cried the third boy, his brown eyes wide with fear, his voice high and panicked. You see that man standing there? He'd shoot us for looking at the window. Forget about breaking it. Perry leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You don't have to stand around and wait for him to shoot you. Just break the window and run when he starts after you. You can't outrun an old man like that. He was banking on the fact that the guard, though likely in his early 30s, would seem ancient to a 13-year-old's eyes. The redhead crossed his arms, unconvinced. Not for €10, we can't. Perry's patience thinned, his tone sharpening. Listen, you little shits. I'll give you 50. Split it however you want. Give the pudgy guy less, I don't care. I just need that guy away from the door for a few seconds so I can get in. The stocky boy scowled at the jab, but the redhead's eyes gleamed with greed. All right, we'll get him away from the door. Where's the money? Perry forked over a 50 and they walked away. He watched tensely as they crossed the street, knowing they could just as easily run off as do the job. But they indeed walked in the direction of his target. As they approached, Perry realized there weren't a lot of rocks laying around the streets of downtown Paris. This was the 21st century, after all. The roads were paved with asphalt, not cobblestones. But he needn't have worried, either about the boys finding stones or doing the job he paid them for. As he continued to monitor their progress, ready to hurry across the road and into the building, he saw them pause by one of the trees. Around its base was a square of earth, covered with white landscaping rocks. They each collected a few. Then things happened quickly. They began to run, and as they passed the guard, the stumpy kid yelled, Hey, Baldy, do you shave your balls, too? He threw his stones, not at a window, but directly at the guard. The other two did throw at the windows, and Perry heard the satisfying sound of shattering glass. With that, they began to sprint in earnest. The guard, fuming, hesitated for a moment, causing Perry to fear that self-control might trump ego. Then the pudgy kid turned and yelled, Can't catch me, bear nuts! That proved to be the tipping point, and the guard reached inside his jacket and started after them. Perry seized the moment, his legs carrying him across the street in 10 seconds flat, weaving through a gap in the pedestrian flow. He slipped through the double doors, the heavy oak swinging shut behind him with a soft whoosh. As he'd hoped, the guard's presence at the entrance meant no secondary sentinel waited inside. The foyer was a study in understated luxury. Marble floors veined with gold, walls paneled in dark walnut, and a crystal chandelier casting prismatic light across the space. 2 hallways branched off at 90-degree angles, lined with polished apartment doors, their brass numbers glinting faintly. Directly ahead, an elevator's sleek stainless steel doors reflected the foyer's opulence, and to its right, a discreet door led to a stairwell. Perry made for the stairwell, his senses on high alert for any sign of additional security, cameras, motion sensors, or another guard lurking in the shadows. Once inside the stairwell, the door clicking shut behind him, Perry paused to catch his breath, the air cool and tinged with the faint scent of concrete and metal. He pulled the GPS tracker from his pocket, its compact screen glowing faintly. He'd checked it earlier while casing the entrance, confirming the signal, Bart's chip, was still strong, pinpointed to the round corner rooms directly above the foyer, likely the turret-like structure under the blue dome. He pushed a button on the side of the device, increasing the volume so he could hear the audible signal which accompanied the flashing red dot. Now, as he climbed the stairs, the signal began to speed up. By the time he'd reached the 6th floor, it was almost a constant beep. But to his surprise, as he continued to the top floor, it slowed again. Bart, or at least Bart's foot, was somewhere on the 6th floor. 12. Perry Hall muted the tracker, the incessant beeping silenced with a press of his thumb. He glanced at the glowing screen one last time, its high resolution map pinpointing the signal's origin to his right, a mere 10 to 15 feet away. His eyes lingered on the backup button, a small red toggle opposite the volume controls, promising reinforcements with a single press. His finger hovered, the weight of his situation pressing against his chest like a lead vest. Perry was brutally honest with himself, his inner voice cutting through the adrenaline. I am in a scorpion stronghold. Aside from the guard I tricked into chasing those kids, I have no idea how many armed men are waiting. Dozens? Maybe more? And I'm 15 feet from either a captured American diplomat, a dead one, or just his damn foot. No sweat. The sarcasm was a thin shield against the dread coiling in his gut, but it steadied him. He pulled his finger back from the panic button and slipped the tracker into his jacket pocket, the device's weight a grim reminder of the stakes. With a slow, deliberate breath, he gripped the stairwell door's handle and eased it open, the hinges whispering faintly in the cool, concrete-scented air. For a moment he stood motionless, holding the door ajar, his ears straining for any sound, footsteps, voices, the click of a weapon being cocked. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of distant machinery. Satisfied no one was lurking nearby, Perry widened the gap just enough to poke his head through. Instinctively, he winced, his body tensing for the possibility of a bullet slamming into his skull before he could assess the scene. When no shot came, he exhaled and scanned the hallway. This hallway, as had been the ones he'd scoped out on the first floor, appeared to be abandoned. He felt a tingle at the back of his neck. It was too easy. But despite a growing foreboding, he moved silently into the hallway and turned to the right. The passage stretched long and narrow, flanked by heavy oak doors, each bearing a polished brass plate. The tracker's signal, Bart's chip, whether still attached to its owner or not, lay behind one of them. Perry moved with excruciating slowness, his Glock held low, his senses razor sharp. The first door loomed ahead, its brass plate gleaming, Bureau de Sécurité, a security office. It was a stroke of luck. Depending on how many men were inside and how quickly he could dispatch them, he might find moving farther down the corridor a little more user-friendly. When he poked his head tentatively through the doorway, the first thing he looked for were men with guns, and he'd seen none. The second thing were cameras, and on this score he was less lucky. There were two, encased in darkened glass semispheres. Because of the dark cover, he could not tell if they were fixed or if they could pivot, but as he had moved toward the security office, no one had burst out firing in his direction, which led him to believe the cameras were pointing, at least for the moment, toward a different part of the hallway. He reached for the door handle, deciding there was no point in attempting stealth this time. His good fortune wasn't going to continue once the security office was breached. There were going to be men inside, and they were not going to be friendly. Pulling the Glock from its holster, he depressed the handle and pushed the door wide. 3 men sat before a sprawling wall of monitors, their chairs swiveling as the door crashed open. In a near comical tableau, their faces contorted into identical masks of shock and fury, realizing in unison that the intruder was no ally. Their hands scrambled for weapons, Berettas by the look of them, but Perry was faster. 5 suppressed shots spat from his Glock in rapid succession, 4 double taps, 2 per target, aimed at the chests of the seated men, and a 5th to the thigh of the third, who'd managed to stand. The first 2 slumped in their chairs, blood blooming across their shirts, their eyes glassy in death. The third collapsed to his knees, one hand clutching the oozing wound in his leg, the other fumbling for his pistol. Perry closed the distance in 2 strides, his boot snapping forward to kick the man's face. The impact sent the guard's head whipping back, blood and teeth spraying as he toppled sideways, sprawling across the floor. Perry stepped on his throat, applying just enough pressure to make breathing a struggle, and pointed at the leg wound, now soaking the man's trousers crimson. That looks like it hurts, Perry said, his voice calm, almost conversational. Baise-toi, the man groaned, his French slurred with pain and defiance. Perry tisked, shaking his head. Language. Now let's try this. Do you speak English? With his voice growing increasingly strained, no doubt due to both the pain ripping through his midsection and the pressure Perry was exerting on his windpipe, the man repeated his original statement. Wrong answer. And I don't need your permission to have sexual intercourse with myself, thank you. Perry removed his foot from the man's throat, but only so he could drop his heel forcefully across the man's mouth. He felt teeth breaking beneath his shoe. The man let out a scream, which morphed into a strangled gasp as Perry returned his weight to the man's throat. Let's try again, shall we? Do you know how to speak words in the English language? The man nodded, his face a mask of blood and fear, but he said nothing. Yay, progress, Perry mocked, his voice dripping with false cheer. There's an American diplomat somewhere in this building. Am I correct? The man's eyes hardened a bit, but when Perry increased the pressure on his throat, he nodded again. Yes, he said in a strangled voice. You're a fast learner. Your mother must be so proud. Now, the diplomat, he's on this floor somewhere, correct? The man's head bobbed in the affirmative. Perry performed a slow clap. Such good work. Clever, smart, industrious. If only you weren't so ugly, you might have a future. Although I suppose breaking all your visible teeth didn't help with that. Sorry. Oh well, dentists can work miracles these days. Next question. Is his wife with him? The man's expression shifted, a flash of reluctance crossing his battered face. He didn't respond, his silence a defiance Perry couldn't tolerate. Perry sighed, feigning disappointment. Ah, and you were head of the class. I'm afraid not answering is a punishable offense. He removed his foot from the man's throat once more, quickly moving it to the bullet wound, which was rapidly turning the man's white shirt a brilliant crimson. Perry stepped down hard on the hole at the center of the blood stain, eliciting a scream far louder than Perry was comfortable with. Quiet, Perry snapped. I'm sensitive to loud noises, even when I'm not hungover. So thoughtless. Kids these days, only thinking of themselves. Don't scream again, young man, or I'll give you something to scream about. We don't want to attract attention. Now, where were we? Ah, yes, the woman. Is the diplomat's wife with him? The man spit a significant amount of blood from his mouth. Yes, asshole. They are together. 2 rooms down on the opposite side of the hallway. Well, that was rude, but you answered my question, so you get a reward. Perry knelt and gently stroked the wounded man's hair. Leaning his mouth close, he whispered, I'm going to make it stop hurting now. A lightning-fast chop to the man's throat instantly crushed his windpipe, and a moment later, he was dead. Perry wiped the blood from the sole of his shoe on the beige carpet, leaving a satisfying smear, and looked at the wall of monitors. He could attribute the luck he'd had in remaining undetected to the sheer volume of views the screens presented. There were easily 70 different scenes flickering before him, and it took him a minute to recognize the one that showed the foyer through which he'd entered the building. They might have had him there if they'd been watching, but the angle of the camera provided a view of only the first 2/3 of the room. He'd moved so quickly to the stairwell that he'd have been visible for only moments. Oddly, it didn't appear the stairwell itself had any cameras at all, and although he was unable to determine which of the multiplicity of screens showed the 6th-floor hallway, he did see that the cameras in those corridors were indeed panning back and forth, a flaw that had likely allowed him to reach the security office undetected. He would have preferred to disable the hallway's cameras before he went back out, but was unable to determine which of the hundreds of buttons and sliders were responsible for them, So he turned to a panel of circuit breakers on the wall adjacent to the monitors and attempted to open it. The panel was securely locked, and he didn't want to take any more time playing around, so he fired two quick shots into it. A shower of sparks told him he damaged something, and as he turned once more to the monitors, he saw that about half had gone black. That'll have to do, he thought. Perry walked back out into the hallway and quickly made his way down the hall to the door the guard had indicated. Its shining label read 617. He tried the handle but found it was locked. Reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket, he extracted a thin metal lockpick and began working the tumblers. Fortunately, the building's 1990s vintage locks had not been replaced with new, more secure models. After only a few seconds, he opened the door. The room was large, its interior dimly lit. There was no sound as he entered and closed the door behind him. As his eyes adjusted to the scant light, he made out a pair of chairs in the middle of the room with a table between them. A lamp from the ceiling, its beam focused directly on the tabletop, was the room's only source of illumination. As he crept forward, his heart sank. The beam illuminated a gallon-sized plastic bag, its contents unmistakable: a severed foot, pale and bloodless, the skin waxy under the harsh light. In the chairs to either side were the bodies of Barton and Amanda Pickering. At least, that was Perry's assumption. Bart was recognizable, even though the expression of horror frozen upon his lifeless visage suggested he had died in considerable agony. The identity of the woman was nothing more than an educated guess, since the body no longer had a head. The scene was a grotesque tableau, a message meant to horrify. Before he could process the sight, a sharp hiss filled the room, followed by a foul chemical stench. Gas. Perry's lungs burned as he gasped, his vision blurring. He dropped to his knees, fury surging at his own carelessness. The room exploded into blinding light, the door crashing open. Two men in gas masks, their automatic rifles glinting, stormed inside. They loomed over Perry, their muffled voices indistinct as his senses faltered. His sight dimmed, the world fading to a pinpoint, then swallowed by blackness. 13. Perry Hall awoke to a pounding headache, the worst he could recall in a life littered with hangovers and concussions. His first groggy thought was that he was sprawled in his New York penthouse, the victim of either a legendary bender or some spectacularly foul liquor. His throat felt like he'd swallowed a fistful of sand, and he called out weakly for his dog, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Flem, where are you, buddy?" Instead of Fleming's familiar snuffle or the patter of paws on hardwood, a burst of harsh laughter answered, followed by a low murmur of two men speaking rapid French. Reality slammed back like a breaking wave. Paris, the Maison Montmartre, the gas trap in room 617. Perry tried to shake his head to clear the fog, but his skull wouldn't budge, locked in place by an unyielding restraint. Panic flickered, but he shoved it down, forcing his eyes open. The scene before him was so surreal, he half wondered if he was still unconscious, trapped in a fevered dream. Three men stood in the dimly lit room. Two were young, their athletic builds clad in tailored black suits, their faces hard and expressionless as they flanked an older man seated in the most ostentatious chair Perry had ever seen. The throne, for it could be called nothing less, was a Baroque monstrosity, its arms and legs carved with swirling rococo flourishes, gleaming with what might have been solid gold, gold leaf, or an audacious paint job. Deep purple cushions, stuffed to bursting, spilled over the edges, their surfaces glittering with what appeared to be embedded gemstones, rubies, emeralds, perhaps even diamonds. The effect was grotesque, a gaudy collision of wealth and excess that Perry's mental thesaurus toggled between bloated and obscene. For all its opulence, The chair looked tortuously uncomfortable, a fitting perch for a man who valued spectacle over sense. Perry coughed, the sound morphing into a choking laugh as the absurdity of the scene hit him. The seated man's face, lined but handsome in a severe, aristocratic way, twisted with surprise and irritation at the outburst. "Something is funny, Mr. Hall?" he asked, the words crisp and precise, carrying the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You're—" Perry began, but then started coughing again. Not only had the gas knocked him out, it appeared to have done a number on his throat. His suffering seemed to improve the man's disposition. The man leaned forward impatiently. "Yes, go ahead." "Your chair," Perry rasped, forcing the words out. "That is the stupidest chair I've ever seen, if you don't mind me saying, King Louis." The man's smile vanished, his eyes narrowing as he sat back, the throne creaking faintly. "A rather mean-spirited remark, but not wholly inaccurate. This throne did, in fact, belong to Louis XIV. Perry grinned, blood trickling from a split lip he hadn't noticed until now. "I was talking about the monkey from the Jungle Book, and the name's Parker. Jared Parker." One of the standing men, his buzz-cut hair and squared jaw giving him the look of a trained attack dog, stepped forward and drove a fist into Perry's jaw. The blow landed with a crack, and because his head was taped immobile, the pain radiated through his skull like a shock wave, stars bursting behind his eyes. Perry tasted copper, his mouth filling with blood. "Yes, we found your identification cards," the seated man continued, unruffled by the violence. "Onyx may not be a particularly effective agency, but your forgery department is to be commended. Do you think we would be unable to run a facial recognition on you, Mr. Hall? Scorpion keeps very detailed files on enemy operatives." Perry spat a wad of blood onto the floor, the red splatter stark against the polished wood. "Scorpions are overrated," he said, his voice steadier now. "Most are a nuisance. The sting hurts, but it's not lethal." The second henchman, leaner but no less menacing, stepped forward and mirrored his partner's punch, his fist slamming into the opposite side of Perry's jaw. The force tore the duct tape securing his head, allowing it to snap sideways, dulling the impact slightly. Perry's mind seized on the detail. Duct tape, not cuffs or rope. A sloppy choice, one that made his escape plan, already forming in the back of his mind, significantly more feasible. "I think you'll find this scorpion quite lethal," the seated man said, his tone smug, his eyes glinting with the confidence of a predator toying with its prey. The pain from the punches was sharp but clarifying, slicing through the last of the gas-induced haze. Barry's eyes darted around the room, taking stock. He was bound to a plain wooden chair, the kind found in a cheap diner, its surface rough under his fingertips. Duct tape encircled his wrists, ankles, and chest, the adhesive pulling at his skin as he tested his bonds. His legs could wiggle slightly, a small but critical range of motion. His hands were tighter, but that was less of a problem than his captors might think. The room itself was sparse, its high ceilings and bare walls giving it the feel of a converted warehouse space. Aside from the throne and the three men, it was empty. No windows, no visible cameras, just a single steel door in the far wall, its surface scuffed and dented. Perry needed time to work his plan, and that meant keeping the man talking. "I'm going out on a limb here," he said, his voice deliberately casual, "but you must be Pierre Montmarche." A junior to mid-level operative would have grown very uncomfortable at being made. It was a natural reaction, even when one appeared to have the upper hand. But neither Perry nor Montmarche were that low in the pecking order. Perry had denied his identity at first, then simply ignored Montmarche as he'd bragged about Scorpion's ability to see past his subterfuge. In Pierre Montmarche's case, however, there was an added element of ego. He thrived upon being recognized. not necessarily as a scorpion adjunct, but in general. Perry was sure his private office would be lousy with pictures of himself, shaking hands with celebrities, cutting ribbons, breaking ground with shovels painted gold. The only thing a man like this loved more than money and power was himself. You are correct, Montemarche replied, his voice smooth as velvet. And this is your building? Correct again. And you're the son of a bitch responsible for my two dead friends in room 617. Perry's tone shifted, his voice rising with feigned rage, his eyes blazing. The outburst was calculated, painting him as emotional and erratic, a man on the edge, not a calculating operative biding his time. You're 3 for 3, batting a thousands, I think you say in American baseball. Something like that, Perry said, returning a tight smile, noting the Frenchman's slight linguistic slip. He leaned forward as much as the tape allowed, his voice dropping to a growl. You can't really think I'm going to let you live after what you've done, can you? Montemarche erupted into laughter, a deep, booming sound that echoed off the bare walls. His henchmen exchanged smirks, feeding off their boss's amusement. You hardly seem positioned to make such a claim, Montemarche said, wiping a tear from his eye. Although your dossier indicates you are psychologically predisposed to outlandish flights of fancy, it also suggests you were, at one time, a premier operative. You must have done something to anger Monsieur Moore for him to assign you to find a diplomat and his spy wife. But that is of no consequence. They are dead, and soon enough you will be as well. You have no inkling of the scope of Scorpion's plans for this city. Still moving his legs in tiny motions, imperceptible in the dim lighting of the room, Perry now gave the appearance of being intrigued by the worm Montemarche had just cast into his pond. Plans? What are you talking about? Montemarche smiled, but for a moment said nothing. Perry feared his better judgment might trump his ego and keep him from talking further. Already knowing the plan, he didn't really care what the Frenchman talked about, only that he kept talking a little longer. He needn't have worried. The man's hubris appeared to have no limit. Your agency was involved in actions which, frankly, would have led to prosecution by the World Court, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. My company was involved in something that would interest The Hague? Perry asked innocently, as he began making headway and loosening the tape around his ankles. I highly doubt that. What were we going to do? Start a nuclear war? 14. Montemarche's eyebrow arched sharply, his piercing gaze locking onto Perry with a mix of amusement and disbelief. After a beat, he erupted into a second fit of laughter, the sound booming off the walls. You should go on a game show with such abilities, he mocked. You are now 4 for 4. Your agency was indeed involved in getting a nuclear device into the hands of some people who would have used it in a manner contrary to the interests of Scorpion, and financially speaking, to my own interests. Terrorism, if used properly, is capable of breaking the spirit of an entire people, but more importantly, it can be highly lucrative. Harry's expression hardened, his jaw clenching as he leaned forward against the duct tape binding him to the chair. You're talking gibberish, he said, his voice deliberately taunting. Shifting the man's mood from smug laughter to irritation was a calculated move to unsettle him, and it worked. Montmarche's smile vanished, his eyes narrowing as he jabbed a manicured finger at Perry. The henchman to his right, the one with the buzz cut and boxer's build, stepped forward and delivered another punishing blow to Perry's jaw. The impact was brutal, the man's knuckles cracking against bone with the precision of a seasoned fighter. Perry's vision swam, stars bursting behind his eyes as he fought to stay conscious. Something shifted in his mouth, and he spat out a bloody molar, the tooth skittering across the polished floor. Montmarche leaned back in his gaudy throne, his composure restored as he watched Perry reel. Our operatives located the bomb, he continued, his tone smug, and after a particularly bloody firefight, we secured it for our own use. All we needed was the arming key and the codes to activate the ignition device. That is where the late Monsieur Pickering came into play. Embassies are shockingly easy to infiltrate, and the office of the chief communications official, though you would think otherwise, equally easy to bug. Pickering was careful not to discuss his possession of the key and codes over the telephone, but he was less cautious in face to face meetings. He arranged a rendezvous at the opera, which we in turn canceled with extreme prejudice. With the bomb, the key, and the codes in our possession, the ball was in our court. I believe you Americans have the best sports analogies. That's an idiom, actually, Perry snarled, his lips curling back to bare, blood-streaked teeth. The Frenchman's smile widened, his eyes glinting with sadistic pleasure, and Perry leaned into the act, playing the role of a man pushed to the edge. In truth, his anger was real, ignited by Montmarch's casual admission of murder and his grandiose plans. We have decided upon a much better use for the nuclear device, the Frenchman went on. Rather than detonating it in some remote, camel-scented village full of zealots who hate your country with a commendable yet misguided passion, we have decided to set it off at Paris Point Zero. Perry was legitimately angry now. The pompous bastard was so sure of himself that he was bragging about murdering millions of people, detonating the nuke at the geographical center of the city, meters from Notre Dame Cathedral. He knew that, although they had the titanium clutch that held the key and the codes, they probably had not yet been able to open it. The clutch, which appeared to the untrained eye to be a thin, solid piece of highly polished metal, in fact had an opening mechanism based on the same principle as the one that kept Perry's secure telephone hidden back on his terrace. Only the correct series of movements across the blank surface could open it, and the possible permutations of such movements were endless. So Montmartre was blowing smoke. That made Perry even angrier, angry and ready at last for action. With a speed that caught all three of his foes off guard, Perry jackknifed his upper body downward while simultaneously inhaling as deeply as he could. The combination of the downward thrust and the expansion of his chest caused the tape holding him to the chair to fail. At the same time, he stood, having freed his feet just enough to allow him to do so. He squatted violently, completely removing the tape from his ankles. He was still attached to the arms of the chair by the tape around his wrists, but in a flurry of motion, Perry leaped into the air, over the back of the chair, landing with the seat now in front of him. As the suspected ex-boxer began to reach inside his jacket for his gun, Perry lifted the chair over his head and smashed it to kindling on the man's head, even as his weapon cleared its holster. Perry grabbed the dazed man's arm and twisted the elbow at an impossible angle, simultaneously grabbing the gun. Using the boxer's own finger along with his own, he shot the other guard in the face before the man could do anything but gape in astonishment at the blur of activity. Ripping the gun free, Perry rammed the barrel into the boxer's mouth, shattering teeth, and squeezed the trigger. The muffled shot ended the man's groans, his body slumping to the floor in a heap. Perry wheeled toward Montmartre, but the Frenchman was already moving. With a smirk, he pressed a ruby embedded in the throne's armrest. The chair lurched backward, a hidden mechanism humming as a hatch slid open in the floor, revealing a polished metal slide reminiscent of a child's playground. Montmartre leaped from the throne, diving onto the slide with surprising agility for a man of his age. Before Perry could lunge forward, a thick steel plate shot out from beneath the throne, sealing the hatch with a resounding clang. Perry sprinted to the trap door and kicked it with all his strength, his boots striking the unyielding metal. Not even a dent. "Is this seriously happening right now?" he muttered aloud, his voice echoing in the empty room. "Did I just see a madman escape via kiddie slide?" Silence answered, the only sound the faint drip of blood from the dead henchman pooling on the floor. Now that he was standing and his life was no longer in immediate danger, he was able to examine the room more thoroughly. Upon doing so, he saw the tracking device he'd been carrying was laying on the seat Montmarche had recently evacuated. He snatched it up, his thumb finding the backup button. He pressed it, and an instant later, Michel Duchamp's voice crackled through the device, urgent but calm. "Eagle, you're 20?" "I'm in Maison Montmarche, exact location unknown," Perry replied, his voice low as he scanned for threats. "Getting out of here is not going to be easy." "Hold on, Eagle. Your device transmits as well as tracks. You appear to be on the 7th floor. Can you make your way to the roof?" "The roof?" Perry's tone was skeptical, his instincts screaming to get out, not up. "Higher in this building is not the direction I want to be going right now." Even as he spoke, the unmistakable thwop-thwop of helicopter blades filtered through the tracker's speaker, faint but growing louder. "We've had the chopper on standby," Duchamp said. "We're 2 minutes out." On the floor behind Montmarche's throne, Perry found his own guns, carelessly tossed aside. "These cretins really thought they were done with me," he chuckled. "Amateurs." He grabbed the weapons, pocketing the .22 and keeping the dead boxer's gun in his other hand. Then he ran to the door. Throwing it open, he saw he was near the corner of two hallways. A round wall with a door at its center was probably the corner office he'd spotted from the ground, the one in the domed tower. As much as he'd like to have gotten in there and poked around, he needed to find a way to the roof. Then, in a moment of clarity, he replayed Montmarche's escape. Obviously, he was a man who enjoyed a quick exit. Perry ran into the round room. As expected, the curved walls were so covered with photos demonstrating Montmarche's superstar status that it was difficult to tell the color of the paint. Near one of the most enormous desks he'd ever seen was a metal ladder, bolted to the wall and leading to a hatch in the ceiling. Next to the ladder was a floor-to-ceiling painting of the god Zeus, only with Montmarche's face on the thunder hurler's body. "Good Lord," Perry muttered. Into the tracker, he said, "Montmarche has a roof-access ladder in his office. This guy's slippery." "That is, at the moment, good news for you," Duchamp replied. "Get your ass topside." As Perry reached for the ladder, the office door burst open, a trio of guards storming in, their submachine guns raised. Perry spun, firing a rapid volley from both pistols. The Beretta and Glock barked in unison, bullets tearing through flesh and bone. The guards collapsed in a heap, blood pooling beneath them, their weapons clattering to the floor. But Perry didn't pause, scrambling up the ladder with practiced ease. He yanked the hatch's handle, the heavy metal swinging downward, and pulled himself through onto the roof. The cold autumn air hit him like a slap, the roar of the approaching helicopter deafening. The chopper hovered just above, its skids glinting in the gray light. Perry leaped, his fingers closing around the skid, his muscles straining as he hauled himself up. Duchamp's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with iron strength, and pulled him aboard. The chopper banked sharply, soaring away from the Maison Montmarche. Moments later, they touched down on a rooftop landing pad atop a low, nondescript building in the southern suburbs, an Onyx Sector safe house. Perry climbed out, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, and drew a deep breath, the air sharp with the scent of rain. "That's as close a call as I'm hoping to run into for the rest of this mission," he said, his voice rough but steady. Duchamp's lips twitched, a wry smile breaking through his grim expression. "The way your luck runs—" "Don't say it," Perry cut him off, his tone emphatic, finger raised in warning. "Don't say a word." 15. Perry Hall sat on a metal cot in the safe house's makeshift infirmary, the sterile scent of antiseptic mingling with the faint tang of his own sweat. A medic, a wiry woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, examined him with practiced efficiency, her gloved hands probing his neck and checking his pupils. She administered an injection, the needle's pinch barely registering against the throbbing in his skull. Within minutes, The lingering fog from the gas he'd inhaled in room 617 began to lift, leaving only a raw, persistent soreness in his throat, as if he'd gargled broken glass. Michel Duchamp leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, a wry smile playing on his lips. So you fell for the old, here's what you came for, now breathe deeply trick, eh? His eyes glinted with a mix of both amusement and concern. Perry grimaced, the movement tugging at the bruises blooming across his jaw. I got a little cocky after taking out the security room and its occupants, he admitted, his voice hoarse but steady. I'm thinking now it was all a setup to lure me into that room with the bodies and the gas. Man, I'd love to get my hands around that bastard's neck. The image of Pierre Montmarche's smug face, framed by that absurd golden throne, fueled a surge of anger, his fingers flexing as if already closing around the man's throat. Duchamp's smile faded, replaced by a raised eyebrow. Did any of your teachers ever mention you don't play well with others? I think you've missed your calling, Perry said, once again grimacing. It's not too late to give up saving the world to go into stand-up comedy, you know. Duchamp ignored the quip, his expression sobering as he pushed off the wall and paced the small room, his polished shoes clicking on the linoleum. At any rate, Montmartre is not going to let your bad manners go unpunished. He casts a very wide net over Paris. His influence is woven into the city's fabric from the elite to the underworld. A wide net over a city he intends to destroy. Perry shook his head at the irony. Fortunately for us, he turned out to be one of those "you're about to die, so I'll brag about my plans" type of maniacs. We know they intend to detonate the bomb near point zero. Duchamp stopped pacing, his gaze sharpening. There are many significant landmarks in that area, he began, his voice measured. I don't think he cares, Perry cut in, his tone blunt. He is not picking a target for its cultural value. He's after maximum impact. Let me finish, Duchamp said, a hint of exasperation creeping into his voice. There are many landmarks, all under significant security protection. He won't be able, for example, to smuggle a nuke into Notre Dame Cathedral. In fact, there's probably nowhere on the Ile de la Cité that would be suitable for such a thing. He gestured vaguely, referencing the island in the Seine's heart, where the cathedral stood, its Gothic spires a beacon of Paris's history. Point Zero, the city's geographic center, was marked by an octagonal brass plate embedded into the cobblestone square before the cathedral's western facade, a spot thronged with tourists posing for photos. Perry nodded, his mind already racing. I see. So we need to find a less famous place in the area, somewhere he can access without tripping every alarm in the city. Oui, Duchamp agreed, rubbing his chin, his silver-streaked hair catching the fluorescent light. Unfortunately, there are thousands of possibilities. Cafes, shops, apartments, all within a stone's throw of point zero. So reason with me, Perry said. Montmartre is a very successful man and has no doubt served Scorpion in such a manner that they are willing to offer him some autonomy. He's free to make decisions that could, if he's successful, alter the way in which Scorpion operates. Duchamp gave a curt nod, his expression attentive. Agreed. He's also batshit crazy, Perry continued, his voice low and intense. I'm sorry, but big picture ulterior motives or not, anyone willing to flip the switch on a megaton nuke in the middle of a world capital is nuts. No offense to his business acumen, but the man's a few croissants short of a bakery. Duchamp's lips twitched, a brief smile breaking through his grim demeanor before he nodded again. No argument there. So, which side of him takes the lead? Perry asked, his tone sharpening as he leaned forward again. The clever operative, plotting with cold precision, or the wannabe supervillain, craving a grand theatrical gesture? Duchamp's brow furrowed, his hands clasping behind his back. Please explain. The megalomaniac in him is going to want a target with significance, a symbolic middle finger to the world, Perry said, his hands gesturing animatedly despite the ache in his jaw. You're right that the big landmarks like Notre Dame are too secure. But maybe a smaller symbol, something that still makes his twisted statement. What else is near point zero that might catch his eye? Duchamp's eyes lit with recognition. Directly across the Seine from the cathedral is Place Rene Viviani. I know the spot, Perry said, picturing the quaint square. It's got that statue of the World War I Prime Minister in the center, surrounded by a modest courtyard with a few benches and trees. Too open, don't you think? No place to hide a device? Even a compact nuke like the one they've got isn't exactly pocket-sized. The suitcase bomb labeled a misnomer. It's more like a steamer trunk. Can't just tuck it under a park bench without someone noticing. You are right, Duchamp conceded, his shoulders sagging slightly. It would be an obvious aberration in the square. Perry's mind churned, his fingers drumming on his knee. Think, man, is there anywhere else nearby? There really is not, Perry, Duchamp said, his voice tinged with frustration. As I said before, there are thousands of buildings into which they could conceivably find a reason to move a large crate, but nothing that stands out as a symbol. Perry's eyes narrowed, a new angle forming. Then maybe the pragmatist in him is calling the shots after all. Maybe detonating near point zero is enough for him, symbol or not. In that case, any of those 1,000 buildings would work, some nondescript warehouse or basement. Unless... He paused, his voice dropping as the idea solidified. Unless what? What if both sides of his personality are in play? Perry said, his eyes locking onto Duchamp's. What if he's found a practical solution to his impractical need for a dramatic statement, a way to blend his cunning with his flair for the theatrical? Duchamp's brow creased, his hand rising to rub his temple. Ah, Perry, you've lost me again, he said, smacking his forehead in exasperation. Perry's lips quirked into a grim smile, undeterred. What if he's planning to move the bomb in plain sight, hiding it where no one would think to look, and float it right next to the cathedral? A barge! Duchamp exclaimed, his voice rising with the sudden clarity of epiphany, his hazel eyes widening as he slapped his palm against the safe house's chipped formica table. The realization hit like a spark in the dim, antiseptic-scented room, cutting through the haze of frustration. A barge, Perry Hall echoed, his tone steady but laced with grim determination. He leaned forward on the metal cot, the creak of its springs punctuating the silence. Timed properly, it could glide along the Seine, just another vessel in the river's endless parade, only to detonate as close to point zero as the water allows, right in the shadow of Notre Dame. It is so obvious, the French operative said, but then his expression fell. It does not help us much, however. What do you mean? Well, there are almost as many boats on the Seine as there are buildings lining its banks, Duchamp explained, his hands gesturing expansively. Barges, tour boats, private yachts, hundreds at any given time. How do we know which one holds the device? Perry's frown deepened, his fingers drumming. Of those hundreds, only one will have the radioactive signature of a nuke, but hopping from craft to craft with a Geiger counter would take far too long. His voice carried a wry edge, picturing himself clambering onto decks with a clicking device, drawing every eye on the river. Not to mention a bit obvious to any unfriendly eyes watching, Duchamp added. Scorpion's operatives would spot you before you check the first hull. Perry slammed his fist into his open palm, the sharp smack echoing in the small room. Damn! There has to be a way to get to Montmartre. Duchamp tilted his head, his gaze probing. He indicated a time frame? Perry shook his head, his dark hair falling into his eyes. No, he said nothing about when, only the where. What I wouldn't give for a few minutes to talk to him, draw him out. The bastard loves boasting about his brilliance. Wouldn't take long for him to slip up and drop something useful. He could still hear Montmarche's smug voice, dripping with arrogance as he outlined his plan to detonate a nuke at Paris Point Zero, the memory stoking the anger smoldering in his chest. Just then, Perry's phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibration jarring against the tense silence. He pulled it out, his thumb hovering over the screen before answering. "Parker," he said, remembering to stick to his cover. "Mr. Hall," came a smooth French voice. Perry's face darkened, his grip tightening on the phone until his knuckles whitened. "Montmartre, you coward," he spat, his voice a low growl. "Did you enjoy your ridiculous trip down the garbage sluice?" Montmarche's chuckle was cool, unruffled. "I will ignore your continued insolence for now," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I am calling with good news. I have asked an old friend of yours to assist me in, shall we say, recollecting you." Perry's blood ran cold, but he forced his voice to stay steady. "No friend of mine would ever assist you in anything, except maybe easing you out of life and into whatever comes next." Montmartre laughed again, the sound grating like nails on a chalkboard. "This is not the time to discuss metaphysical questions of life and afterlife. This is the time to rekindle old acquaintances. Here, I will show you." Perry heard the faint rustle of the phone being passed. A moment of silence followed, heavy with dread, before a voice slithered through the speaker, a voice that froze the air in his lungs. It was a voice he'd heard 1,000 times, etched into his soul from the security recording he'd played on repeat, night after night in the months after Trina's death. "Perry," the voice said, smooth and mocking, "how nice to speak to you. I've thought about you often since the night I killed your wife." "Flick." Perry's voice was simultaneously flat and deadly as he uttered that single word. Perry didn't laugh, but the smirk in his voice was palpable. "None other. You need to know I'm heading to your suite at the Hotel de Londres. I'll wait for you there until 1700 hours. If you don't appear, I will kill the last remaining piece of your beloved Trina. Your fat, stupid dog." "Don't you dare mention her name," Perry said, his voice losing its flatness, now trembling with a fury so intense it threatened to consume him. His hands shook, his pulse hammering in his ears, and he felt a primal urge to lash out, to destroy everything in reach, friend or foe. This time, Flick did laugh, and the sound turned Perry's insides into molten rock. His vision blinked red and swam before his eyes. "And why not?" the killer said. "She and I shared such an intimate moment. I don't believe two people can be any closer than the instant at which one dies." "Bastard. I'll tear you to pieces with my bare hands, do you hear me? I will kill you for days." Perry continued screaming into the phone for minutes before he realized the line was dead. Duchamp stood quietly across the room, his expression one of pained understanding. He knew better than to interrupt Perry's anguish, giving him space to wrestle with the storm raging inside. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "I'll drive you back into the city." Perry's eyes, wild and unfocused, snapped to Duchamp. "He's not going to hurt my dog," he said, his voice low and resolute, a vow as much to himself as to his friend. "Fleming's all I have left." Duchamp studied Perry, noting the tremor in his hands, the barely contained volatility in his posture. He crossed to a small table by the wall, where an unopened bottle of scotch gleamed under the fluorescent light. He hesitated, aware that offering Perry a drink at this fragile moment could tip him into a dangerous spiral. But he also knew the calming power of a single shot for a man on the edge. He poured a measure into a chipped glass and set it before Perry, the amber liquid catching the light. Perry stared at the glass for a full minute, his breathing ragged, his gaze fixed on the scotch as if it held answers or oblivion. Then, lifting his eyes to meet Duchamp's, he pushed the glass away with a slow, deliberate motion. "Not today," he said, his voice steady despite the storm within. "Not when Flick is this close." Duchamp nodded, respect flickering in his eyes. He picked up the glass and downed the shot in one swift gulp, the burn of the whiskey grounding him. "If you don't need it, I sure as hell do," he said, setting the glass down with a soft clink. 16. Perry Hall and Michel Duchamp pulled up to the Hotel de Londres at 4:25 p.m. With over half an hour before Flick's deadline of 5 p.m., Perry didn't hesitate. He bolted from the car, his boots pounding the pavement as he raced through the hotel's revolving door, bypassing the ornate lobby's gilded mirrors and plush velvet chairs. The elevator was too slow for his blood, so he took the stairs to the 14th floor, two at a time, his breath sharp and controlled despite the fire in his lungs. Duchamp followed close behind. At the door to his suite, Perry paused, his key card hovering over the reader. The lock's distinctive beep would announce his arrival to anyone inside, but stealth was a luxury he couldn't afford, not with Fleming's life on the line and Flick's taunting voice still echoing in his mind. He slid the card through, the beep piercing the silence, and shouldered the door open, his Glock drawn and steady in a two-handed grip, its muzzle sweeping the entryway. Duchamp positioned himself to the left of the doorway, his pistol at the ready, his body angled to cover Perry's flank. When no shots rang out, Duchamp eased inside, his movements fluid as he followed Perry down the short entry hall. Two doors branched off, one to a small office, the other to a kitchenette, both ajar, their interiors dimly lit by the gray light filtering through the suite's windows. Perry cleared each room with a quick pivot, his Glock trained on the empty spaces. No flick, no ambush, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant clatter of Parisian traffic. A soft scuffle from the bedroom snapped both agents to attention, their guns whipping toward the sound. Perry's heart lurched, but relief flooded him as Fleming waddled into view. The dog's soulful eyes locked onto him, unharmed and oblivious to the danger that had threatened him. Perry dropped to one knee, holstering his Glock to ruffle Fleming's ears. Duchamp moved past, gun still raised, and swept the bedroom, his voice carrying back a moment later. "It's clear. He's not here, Perry." "Good. And bad," Perry said, his voice low as he stood, one hand lingering on Fleming's head. "Flem's safe, but Flick's out there. Doing what?" As if in answer, Perry's phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibration sharp against the tense silence. He pulled it out, the screen glowing with an unknown number. His jaw tightened, and he answered, his voice a controlled growl. "Flick." "Not very sporting, Perry," came the assassin's voice, smooth and laced with that faint accent that set Perry's teeth on edge. The words dripped with mock disappointment. "What are you talking about?" Perry snapped, his free hand clenching into a fist. "Why, I told you to come meet with me, but you've brought a friend," Flick said. "I assumed you understood you were to come alone." "Sorry, scumbag," Perry shot back, his tone venomous. "You don't get to call the shots." Flick's chuckle was low and infuriating, like the rasp of a blade being sharpened. "I was definitely calling the shot when you opened your balcony door yesterday." Perry's grip on the phone tightened. "So that was you. Seems a bit unlike you to use a sniper rifle when you'd so much prefer your blade." "Ah, Perry," Flick said, his voice almost wistful. "We are professionals, you and I, and as professionals we must sometimes work outside our chosen milieu. You, for example, would prefer to kill with your bare hands, but since arriving in Paris, you've been using your gun often, and to profound effect." "I'd prefer to kill you with my bare hands," Perry snarled, his voice trembling with barely contained fury, the image of Trina's bloodied body fueling the rage. "Which is precisely what I intend to do. I kill you, you kill me, so much talk about killing," Flick mused, his tone mocking. "This is Paris. Let's talk about love." "All right," Perry said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I'd love to kill you with my bare hands." Flick laughed again, the sound grating against Perry's nerves. You miss my point, he said, pausing to let the double entendre hang in the air, a cruel jab at Perry's grief. You think you're clever, don't you? Perry said, his eyes narrowing as he paced the suite's living area, the plush carpet muffling his steps. I think our shared history proves exactly that, Flick replied, his voice smug. You wouldn't know me if you tripped over my foot, which in my case is still attached. Yet we are intimately connected. You know nothing about me, and I know everything about you. Yes, Perry, I am very clever. Clever people die as hard as dumb ones, Perry countered, his tone icy. Sometimes harder because they were too clever. Why don't we put that notion to a test? Flick said, his voice taking on a playful lilt. I am going to do you a favor now. Actually, the third favor I've done for you. You've done 2 favors already? Perry asked, skepticism dripping from his words as he glanced at Duchamp, who was listening intently. Yes, I did not kill your dog, though I could easily have done so. And I intentionally missed your head when I fired at you yesterday. Perry looked down at Fleming, who gazed back with unwavering adoration, his tongue lolling slightly. The thought of Flick's hands near his dog sent a fresh wave of anger through him. You didn't kill my dog, I'll give you that, he said. But as for the shot, I'm going to say you missed because you're a lousy sniper. Have it your way, Flick said, unperturbed. In either case, here is the third favor. I'm going to tell you exactly where I am. You can come and get me if you'd like. You can even bring your friend. It matters not to me at all. Perry strode to the suite's sliding glass doors, his boots sinking into the carpet, and eased back the heavy curtain just enough to peer out. The Parisian skyline stretched before him, a jumble of rooftops and spires under the overcast sky. Any number of buildings could have served as Flick's vantage point for the sniper shot, their windows glinting dully in the gray light. He scanned them, his eyes sharp, searching for a clue. Just as he was about to let the curtain fall, a faint glint flashed from a balcony window on a building directly across the street, its line of sight unobstructed. Did you see it? Flick's voice came through the phone, laced with amusement. That's your only clue. My tiny flick of light. I saw it, Perry said, his voice cold as he disconnected the call. He had no more words for the assassin, not until he could stare into Flick's eyes and make good on his promise. The glint had been deliberate, a taunt, and Perry's blood burned with the need to answer it. Duchamp was already moving, his steps purposeful toward the door, his face set in grim determination. Wait a second, Perry said, holding up a hand as he crossed to the hotel phone on the side table. Bonjour, Monsieur Parker. How can I assist you? I need to speak directly to Pete, Perry said, his tone urgent but controlled. The groom? The receptionist asked, a touch of confusion in her voice. The bellhop, yes, Perry clarified. I need to speak to him at once. One moment. The line went quiet, and Perry tapped his foot, the seconds stretching taut. In under 10 seconds, Pete's high, eager voice came through. Monsieur Parker? Pete, I need someone to keep an eye on Fleming for me, right away, Perry said, glancing at his dog, who had settled onto the carpet, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. I will see to it myself, Pete replied without hesitation, his sincerity clear even through the phone. Good. Merci, Perry said, a flicker of relief cutting through his tension. De rien, Pete answered, and the line clicked off. Perry popped the magazine from his Glock, inspecting the rounds with a practiced eye before slamming it back into place with a satisfying click. He looked at Duchamp, who gave a curt nod, his Colt ready. Okay, now we can go, Perry said, his voice hard. 17. Perry's training as both a cop and an Onyx Sector operative had honed his ability to pinpoint a room from its exterior balcony with uncanny precision, a skill that now guided him as he and Michel Duchamp raced across Rue Augureau. The glint from Flick's taunting signal had flashed for only a moment, but Perry's sharp eyes had fixed its origin to a balcony near the center of either the ninth or 10th floor of the upscale condominium building opposite his hotel. As they dodged through the late afternoon traffic, horns blaring and tires squealing, Perry pointed upward, his Glock already in his hand, the weight of it steadying his resolve. "You see the balcony with the red flowers?" he asked, his voice cutting through the urban din. Duchamp nodded. "It was the balcony just to the right of it, either on the same floor or the one above," Perry said, his eyes narrowing as he recalculated the angle. "He showed the flash so quickly I couldn't pin the exact floor, especially since I wasn't expecting it." "Close enough," Duchamp replied, his tone clipped but calm. "Which floor do you want to take?" 10, Perry decided, his gut leaning toward the higher vantage point. "You take 9. I don't know this building well. Do you?" They reached the glass-fronted entrance, its polished brass frame reflecting the overcast sky. Duchamp nodded as they pushed through, his movements fluid despite the urgency. "Upscale condominiums, for those who want to vacation steps from the Eiffel Tower. Even fancier than your hotel." "That means Flick's either got a condo here or he's done something nasty to the renters," Barry said, his voice grim as they barreled toward the stairwell. The lobby was a study in opulence. Marble floors, a crystal chandelier casting prismatic light, and a doorman in a crisp uniform who eyed them warily. Duchamp flashed a laminated card that vaguely resembled police credentials, his expression authoritative. The doorman hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing them to pass without a word. "Is that a police ID?" Perry asked, his boots pounding the stairs as they began their ascent, the echo of their steps reverberating in the enclosed space. Duchamp's lips twitched into a wry smile. "It came with the wallet," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I had it laminated. Works like a charm, unless someone asks to inspect it closely, then I go to Plan B." "What's Plan B?" Perry asked, his breath steady despite the climb. Duchamp held up the Colt, the gesture speaking volumes. It did not take them long to scale the 9 stories. At the 9th-floor landing, Duchamp paused, his hand on the stairwell door, his eyes meeting Perry's. "Be careful, Michel," Perry said, his voice low and urgent. "This guy is evil and dangerous. Don't underestimate him." Duchamp, sensing the weight of Perry's personal stake, Trina's murder, Flick's taunts, gave a solemn nod, his usual levity absent. He pushed through the door, disappearing into the 9th-floor hallway, while Perry continued upward, his heart pounding not just from exertion, but from the primal need to confront the man who'd torn his world apart. On the 10th floor, Perry eased the stairwell door open, his Glock raised, and stepped into the hallway, its plush beige carpet muffling his steps. He took a moment to orient himself, scanning for threats. 2 security cameras, one at each end of the corridor, their lenses glinting under domed covers, caught his eye. They didn't worry him unduly. Flick was unlikely to be monitoring from a security office, but he noted their position, wary of the assassin's cunning. Flick might have hacked the system to track his approach, turning the building's own defenses against him. Looking to his left, he estimated which doorway corresponded with the location of the glint, and seeing 4 doors in that direction, ascertained it was most likely the second door in which he was interested. Staying close to the wall, he quickly moved toward it. A plastic plate on the beige door said 10-5, and he hesitated, looking down the hallway once more to see if he still liked his original assessment. It had to be this condo. He tried the door. Locked. And this time the lock was electronic. There would be no picking this one. He took a step back and gave the door a powerful kick. The jamb splintered and the door flew open. Perry knew at once he'd picked the wrong floor. A young couple lay on the floor of the condo, completely naked and tied together with nylon rope. Their mouths had each been stuffed with a rag, and clear packing tape had been wrapped around them to keep the fabric gags in place. They were both alive and clearly terrified as Perry crashed into their condo, gun drawn. The only injury to either was the man's right arm, to which a piece of paper had been stapled. A thin line of blood had stained it, but the words upon the sheet could still be clearly read. You lose. Again. Perry cursed, his heart sinking as he realized Flick had baited him to the wrong floor. The woman's muffled cries grew frantic, her body jerking against the ropes. Perry turned to her, his voice urgent but firm. My friend is in danger. You're safe. I'll be back. He hoped it was true, but doubt gnawed at him as he sprinted back to the stairwell, his boots pounding the carpet. Descending to the 9th floor, Perry moved silently along the hall that led from the entrance. He felt the hair on the back of his neck begin to stand up. There was a distinctive odor present. In his years of service, he'd smelled it a couple of times. A sickly, faintly metallic aroma, only encountered in locations with lots of blood, Perry muttered. And blood there was. It seemed to be everywhere, beginning at the end of the hallway where a small puddle stretched into the next room, curling to the left as the victim had apparently been dragged. With growing apprehension, Perry moved in that direction. As he turned the corner, his gun entering the room first, he saw a sight that made his knees start to buckle. In the middle of the room, directly in front of the balcony doors, he saw Duchamp lying nude on the floor in a still widening pool of blood, his clothing bunched up beneath his head. A small wound on his neck, exactly in the spot Flick had punctured Trina's throat, was no longer spurting, as Lion's heart had clearly stopped beating. He was posed exactly in the same way Trina had been. Perry's head began to spin. He looked at his friend, but saw his wife instead. His vision began to blur as tears filled his eyes. Poised on the precipice of despair, Perry Hall let loose a scream, not of horror or defeat, but of pure animal rage. He shook his head violently, continuing to scream. Flick is near, and I am going to kill him. That thought, combined with the cathartic screams, brought him back to the present. Perry examined the slain agent and noticed something he hadn't seen at first, a single bloody footprint near Duchamp's head. Flick had never been this careless before. He guessed the speed with which he'd left the 10th floor had caused the assassin to rush, making him uncharacteristically sloppy. He looked at the shoe print. It looked like a sneaker tread, unremarkable save for one thing. Amid the lined pattern was a 5-pointed star, clearly visible in red outline on the white carpet. Perry looked around the condo, quickly sizing up all the places someone might hide, and there were plenty. He moved toward a recessed alcove angled in a way that denied him the ability to see if someone was tucked inside. As he began to close on it, he heard a sound from the direction he'd just come. Whirling around, he realized it had been the sound of glass breaking, something small, something like a mirror. Looking through the doors to the balcony, he thought he saw a shadow flicker briefly across the glass. He moved toward it, keeping close to the wall. Like the sliders in his suite, these had heavy, room-darkening blinds installed, but they were drawn back. As he approached, he could clearly see the right side of the outdoor space, not so the left. He was almost to the door now. It was pulled slightly open. He reached for the handle to pull it farther back, when the curtain beside him fluttered. Before he could react, an arm reached out, holding a Desert Eagle .50 caliber pistol. Perry saw the motion from the corner of his eye, but he was at an awkward angle and couldn't move out of the way. The heavy pistol came down hard on the back of his head. 18. In the movies, they always depict the person who has been knocked unconscious as coming to rather quickly. Maybe he blinks his eyes a few times, rubs his head once or twice, then he is ready to find out his fate. In reality, it is a slow and painful process. Perry opened his eyes to find his vision so blurred he thought he must be underwater. He slipped into insensibility before he could realize he was breathing, and therefore not underwater at all. Several minutes later, his eyes fluttered open again, and he was vaguely aware the room he was in was rocking slightly. He had just enough time to decide he was trapped in an earthquake before darkness took him again. The third time, Perry forced his eyes to stay open, each blink a battle against the searing pain in his skull. His head throbbed as if a sledgehammer had taken up residence, the epicenter a swollen lump at the back where the desert eagle had struck. He reached with his right hand, fingers probing the tender knot, wincing at the contact. His left hand, however, moved only an inch before stopping short, metal biting into his wrist. Squinting through the haze, he saw a handcuff chaining him to a heavy cylindrical object bolted to the floor. The surface beneath him was cold steel, swaying gently. It took him several more minutes before his brain came online enough to accurately survey his situation. When he did, he realized the swaying of the room was because it was, in fact, the interior of a river barge. And although he had not spent a huge amount of time near thermonuclear devices, he gradually realized he was handcuffed to one right now. "I hate it when I'm right," Perry muttered, his voice hoarse, the words echoing in the confined space. To his surprise, a woman's voice answered, sharp and familiar. "And how often does that happen?" Perry's head snapped up, the movement sending a fresh wave of pain through his skull. His vision, still struggling with close objects, like the bomb now tethered to him, strained to focus on the figure seated a few feet away, handcuffed to a rusted wall railing. The effort was Herculean, his concussion making distant shapes waver, but gradually the form resolved into a woman with sharp features and hair pulled back tightly. Her eyes, weary but defiant, met his. "Amanda?" Perry croaked, disbelief coloring his tone. "Hello, Perry," she said, her voice steady but laced with a bitter edge. "But you have a head. You're alive." The words tumbled out, his mind grappling with the memory of the headless corpse slumped beside Barton Pickering's tortured body. "Well, I've always had bad luck," Amanda replied, her sarcasm cutting through the air like a blade. The words echoed Perry's own gallows humor, stirring memories of loss he'd rather not face. They killed Bart when he refused to help them open the clutch. They tried everything, beat him, burned him, even cut off his foot. That was partly to torture him, partly to trap me. Perry nodded, the motion sluggish. "We figured that's what happened," he said, his throat still raw from the gas and the beating. "Who is we?" Amanda asked. "Duchamp and I." "Duchamp? He's not coming," Perry said, speaking quickly to prevent Amanda from anticipating a last-minute rescue. "He ran afoul of Flick." Amanda's face fell, her shoulders sagging against the railing. "Flick? Oh, I'm sorry, Perry." Her voice carried genuine sorrow, understanding the weight of Flick's name to him. Perry surprised himself by uttering a derisive laugh. "I suppose I should be saying the same to you. I don't know who might be the headless woman I saw in that shrine to Bart's foot, but that was definitely him in the other chair." Amanda nodded. "I saw that beautiful display. Staged for your benefit, I believe, to convince you we were both dead while they continued to work on me. I'm pretty sure it was a prostitute in Montmarche's employ that you saw." "Prostitution as well as legitimate enterprises." Perry's lips curled into a humorless smile. "Our friend Montmarche likes to cover every angle, I guess. But what do you mean, work on you?" Amanda's gaze dropped to the floor, her voice lowering as she recounted the ordeal. "When Bart refused to reveal the access pattern to the titanium clutch, they brought me in. I was prepared for physical torture. They put me in a room next to where they were hurting Bart, and I heard his screams. I steeled myself for the same. But instead, they held a gun to Bart's head and told me they'd pull the trigger if I didn't reveal the secret. I was brave, Perry, for about a second. But when they pulled the hammer back, I screamed, left, left, down, up, right. And a moment later, the clutch was open." Her voice cracked and she swallowed hard. It was then they swiveled Bart's chair around to show me they'd already killed him with a bullet between the eyes. I betrayed the free world to save a man already beyond saving. Perry's jaw tightened, his free hand clenching into a fist against the barge's swaying floor. The betrayal wasn't hers. It was Montmarch's cruelty, exploiting her love for Bart to break her. She'd been coerced into giving Scorpion the key to the titanium clutch, believing she could save Bart, only to learn he was already dead. The nuke beside Perry, its cold steel biting into his wrist through the handcuffs, was now fully armed, a ticking testament to her betrayal and Montmarch's ruthlessness. A shaft of pale light sliced through the barge's hold as the overhead hatch creaked open, a groan of metal echoing in the cramped space. 3 pairs of boots descended the steep, rusted steps, their steps deliberate. Perry squinted against the glare, his concussed brain struggling to focus. The first 2 men were strangers, scorpion muscle, their black suits crisp, their faces blank with professional detachment. The third was Pierre Montmarch, his tailored coat immaculate, his aristocratic features lit with a jovial smirk. "Well, well," Montmarch said, his voice dripping with mock warmth. "A heartwarming Onyx reunion. Have you been reminiscing about all the people of the world you've helped subjugate?" He spread his arms theatrically as if addressing an audience. "Don't talk ideology to me, you piece of garbage," Perry spat, his voice raw with fury. "You'd subjugate your own mother if there was a euro or 2 in it." Montmarch's mouth thinned into a wan smile. "I'm afraid your attempt at shaming me has no teeth, Mr. Hall. I made what money I could from my mother years ago. But you are right. I care nothing for the more esoteric causes of my organization. It is correct there are some in Scorpion you would characterize as—" He turned to the shorter of the 2 men who were accompanying him. "Quelle est l'expression que les Américains utilisent?" "Vrai croyant," the man grunted, his voice thick with a Parisian accent. "Ah, true believer, yes," Montmarch continued, turning back to Perry. "We have some true believers in our ranks. I do not take much stock in what they say. For me, it is most definitely about the financial transaction." Perry's eyes narrowed, skepticism cutting through his pain. "So how does destroying Paris and murdering millions work to your financial good?" Montmarch laughed, a rich, booming sound that filled the hold. "Why, the insurance checks alone will net me close to $1 billion. He gestured expansively as if counting imaginary stacks of cash. "But that is short-sighted, Mr. Hall. The real money will come from governments who believe the same could happen in their capitals. €1 billion will be a—" He glanced at the squat henchman again, expectant. "Une goutte d'eau dans l'océan. A drop in the ocean, yes." Montmarch chuckled at his own linguistic stumble. "Dear me, I really must brush up on my American idioms." "Good idea," Perry shot back, his voice laced with venom. "I have 1 or 2 I'd like to try out on you. Let's start with No time," Montmarch cut him off, his tone abruptly sharp, his hand raised like a conductor silencing an orchestra. He glanced at the nuke, its digital display glowing with green numerals counting down relentlessly. "I see by the lovely descending numerals on the handy digital readout that our little friend will detonate in just over 15 minutes. That idiom I do know. Say hello to my little friend." "That's not an idiom, moron," Perry growled. "It's a quote from Scarface." Yes, of course," Montmarch said, waving a dismissive hand, his rings catching the light. "It is time for you to start your voyage toward the Ile de Cité Notre Dame and molecular annihilation. I don't imagine it will hurt Mr. Hall, and that is, of course, unfortunate, but there will be pain. The few survivors of the actual blast will know much suffering, and that, mon ami, is another commodity I take immense pleasure in trading." Montmarch turned to the 2 men. To the shorter one, he gave instructions to engage the automatic navigation system on the barge and to inform the helicopter pilot to prepare for departure. The taller man was instructed to make sure the handcuffs of both Amanda and Perry were tight and secure. For the first time, Perry took note of this second man. There was something about his face he disliked immediately. He was also dressed differently than the rest of the flunkies, sweatshirt, jeans, and sneakers instead of the polished black shoes of the others. Perry imagined his voice would be equally annoying, though Montmartre had not spoken to him at all. The man went first to Amanda, squeezing the cuff until it bit into her wrist hard enough to make her wince, a notable reaction given Amanda's legendary tolerance for physical pain. The reaction made Montmartre, who waited by the stairs, smile. The man then walked toward Perry. Even at this late moment, Perry's mind raced as he worked through all the ways he might possibly take the tall man out when he got close enough. But even as the man moved within range of Perry's feet, which were unfettered, he realized even if he disabled him, even if he killed him, he would still be handcuffed to a nuke, and the other two would be able to come and go as they pleased. A grim pall fell over his spirit as he began to accept his fate. The man reached him, and Perry heard a faint, liquid sound. He noticed for the first time there was a small pool of blood next to him, no doubt from the back of his head, where Flick had pistol-whipped him. The man had stepped in it as he cinched the cuff tight around Perry's wrist. As the man walked away, satisfied the cuff was as tight as he could get it, Perry heard Montmartre speak from the top of the stairs. "Farewell, Mr. Hall. It is now time for me to leave the city, so that I can enjoy the end of Paris from a safe distance. I hope you and Mrs. Pickering have a pleasant, transition." The casually dressed man let out a quiet laugh, a low, chilling sound, and began climbing the stairs. Perry's eyes dropped to the floor, drawn by a glint in the light spilling from the open hatch. His heart lurched. There, etched in blood, was a footprint, a sneakered tread with a distinct, five-pointed star at its center, identical to the one beside Duchamp's body. Realization hit like a thunderbolt. "Flick! Flick! Get back here, you filth!" Perry roared, his voice raw with rage, straining against the handcuff until the metal cut into his skin. The man paused at the hatch, turning to face Perry. His lips curled into a horrible grin, his cold eyes gleaming with sadistic glee. He snapped a crisp salute, a final taunt, before stepping through. The hatch slammed shut with a resounding clang, sealing Perry and Amanda in the hold with the ticking nuke. 19. It did not take long for reason and logic to begin draining away from Perry's long-suffering mind. From where he sat, he could see the timer counting down. Perry's knowledge of nukes was limited, but he knew timers weren't standard. This was psychological warfare, designed to break him and Amanda as they awaited annihilation. He could hear Amanda sobbing, quiet at first, then rising in pitch and intensity until it became hysterical. Perry understood her despair, its weight heavier than his own. His death, a fleeting instant of obliteration, held little terror for him. He'd danced with mortality too often to fear it. But Amanda faced not just her own end, but the fresh wound of Bart's murder and the crushing guilt of her coerced betrayal, which had handed Scorpion the means to erase untold lives. Her screams clawed at Perry's resolve, pulling him toward a familiar abyss, the same torturous spiral he'd endured in the lonely nights after Trina's murder. His mind unraveled, haunted by a missed chance. Flick, the man who'd killed Trina, had stood within reach, his sneaker leaving that damning five-pointed star in Perry's blood. Even with one hand cuffed, Perry could have struck. Swift kick to the knee, a lunge to tear out Flick's throat with his free hand or even his teeth. The realization that he'd let his wife's killer walk away, after years of envisioning his death in countless brutal ways, pushed Perry past reason into a delirium where guilt and rage consumed him. He began to hallucinate. At first, he just saw her eyes, so blue, so illogically blue. Then, little by little, her face materialized around the eyes. Her beauty was complete and perfect, even in the wispy, almost wraith-like form it was taking. She was smiling, a breeze playing through her hair. Amanda's screams tried to break through Perry's delirium, but they could not. To him, they sounded like the buzz of a distant bee or a discordant bird call. No human could produce such sounds, his mind told him. Trina was wholly formed now. She stood before him, beaming, exactly as she had when the justice had pronounced him husband and wife. He had never seen a person's face look happier than hers had in that moment, but that was only because he couldn't see his own. It seemed to Perry, as he fell further and further from his gruesome reality, that she hovered just above the floor, and as he looked, he realized she was floating above the bloody print on the floor of the hold. It was as if she was silently confirming her murderer's identity, and, Perry now realized in even deeper anguish, reproaching him for letting Flick escape. And then the fluttering specter slowly raised her arm. As Perry watched in horror, she reached out her finger and pointed at him, accusing him of killing her a second time by letting Flick escape. As his last scrap of sanity fled, Perry saw blood begin to shoot in pulsing bursts from a tiny incision on her throat. She was screaming. Or was it Amanda? Or both? He couldn't tell. It might have even been him. It didn't matter. His vision began to falter. Trina began to dissipate before him, until she was little more than fog, then a mist, then nothing. As she faded and was no longer between Perry and the timer on the bomb, it seemed to his failing mind that the minute digit was a single number now. It could have been 9, it could have been 1. Amanda's crazed screams suddenly ceased, but not because she had grown silent. It was because Perry, his mind's boundaries distorted and shattered, had shut down. He slumped into unconsciousness. But even this provided no relief, for now he saw even more images of horror. The photos of Trina dead on the floor, Duchamp displayed in the same way, the Trade Center towers exploding and collapsing, his parents incinerated as they did. He saw every painful moment of his entire, miserable life compressed into a single instant. Perry willed his eyes to snap open once more. Facing his own end would be easier than seeing the twisted displays of his broken mind. He had no idea how long he'd been unconscious. Amanda had truly stopped screaming now. He forced himself not to look at the timer. The end would come when it came. A brilliant flash of light blinded him, followed by dog slobber. The unmistakable sound of Fleming's bark cut through the haze. Perry shook his head, his vision clearing just enough to see his dog clambering onto his lap, paws scrambling up his chest, tongue lashing his face with enthusiastic licks, as if Perry were slathered in peanut butter. "What the hell? How? Where?" Perry stammered, his concussed brain struggling to process the surreal sight. "One moment, Monsieur Ego. I must concentrate," came a voice, urgent but focused. Perry turned, wincing at the pain, and saw Pete, the bellhop from the Hotel de Londres, hunched over a compact tablet connected to the nuke by a thin white cable. Pete's fingers danced across the screen, his face taut with concentration, beads of sweat on his brow. Perry risked a glance at the timer, its green numerals still counting down, and it was a stark reminder of the mere seconds slipping away. 20. The nuke's timer glowed with a merciless green, its digits plummeting toward 0. 15 seconds remained, each tick a hammer blow to Perry Hall's frayed nerves. Beside him, Pete, the unassuming bellhop turned explosive savant, hunched over his tablet, fingers flying across the screen as he battled the device's detonation sequence. The thin white cable connecting the tablet to the nuke trembled with the barge's sway on the Seine. "Mad!" Pete cursed, his voice cracking with urgency. "Mad, mad, mad!" Less cursing and more fingers, Perry croaked, his voice raw, his head still throbbing from Flick's blow. Hope flickered, fragile and untested, as he watched the young agent work. I'm trying, Pete snapped, his brow slick with sweat, his focus unbroken. Perry's eyes locked on the timer, daring to believe salvation was possible. The digits fell. 8, 7, 6, 6. Still 6. The counter froze, its relentless march halted. A breathless silence gripped the hold. Pete let out a triumphant whoop, his voice echoing off the rusted walls. No more mad, he shouted, his face breaking into a grin. From across the hold, a faint groan signaled Amanda stirring, her hysteria spent. Perry's gaze lingered on the timer, confirming it had stopped, the green 6 unyielding. Pete spoke into a comlink hidden in a shirt cuff, his voice crisp with authority. Within moments, the hatch above burst open, and a half-dozen figures, Onyx agents mingled with French National Police, swarmed down the steps. Their movements were precise, uncuffing Perry and Amanda with practiced efficiency, their faces grim but focused. Fleming, Perry's bulldog, stayed glued to his side, nearly tripping him with his eager waddling as they were escorted to the deck. Perry blinked against the sunlight, his eyes drawn to the left where Notre Dame's Gothic spires loomed, majestic and untouched. The barge's auto-navigation had aligned perfectly with Montmarche's plan, positioning the nuke mere meters from point zero. Had Pete arrived a minute later, Paris would be a smoldering crater, but 6 seconds, 6 precious seconds, had made the difference. On the riverbank, a chaotic scene unfolded. Police cordons, flashing lights, and curious onlookers held back by stern-faced officers. Perry, Amanda, and Fleming were ushered to an unmarked black sedan, its tinted windows shielding them from prying eyes. Pete slid into the back seat beside Perry, while Amanda was guided to another vehicle, her expression vacant but alive. As the car pulled away, tires crunching on gravel, Pete glanced at Perry, a mischievous smile playing on his lips. What's funny? Perry asked, his voice rough, one hand resting on Fleming's head as the dog nestled against him. The confusion on your face, Pete said. I see this last-minute reprieve has taken you somewhat by surprise. Perry huffed, a wry smile tugging at his bruised lips. Tell me, Pete, is massive understatement a part of French culture or just a specialty of yours, in addition to nuclear bomb disarmament? Pete waved a hand, brushing off the praise with a theatrical flourish. Technically, I did not disarm it. I merely interrupted the detonation. Either way, you're my hero, Perry said, his tone earnest, a rare crack in his hardened exterior. No, Pete countered, leaning down to scratch Fleming's ears, eliciting a contented grunt from the dog. This is the real hero. Fleming? Perry asked, glancing at his hound, whose soulful eyes gazed back with unwavering loyalty. Pete laughed, a bright, infectious sound. Certainement. You recall I promised to look after him personally when you contacted me at the desk, upsetting the clerk considerably, I might add. I'm afraid I may have forfeited my position at the hotel. I'll see you get work, Perry said, a genuine chuckle escaping him, the first in what felt like days. At any rate, Pete continued, soon after I arrived in your suite, Fleming began acting quite perturbed, barking wildly and spinning in circles. I assumed he needed a squat, so I affixed his leash and brought him outside for a walk. He immediately pulled free of my grasp and began to tear down the rue. Tear? Perry raised an eyebrow, incredulous. I didn't realize the fat boy had the ability to tear anywhere. He can be speedy when he desires to be, I assure you, Pete said, his eyes twinkling. But he was also mindful that I have only 2 legs, and when I fell too far behind, he waited for me to catch up before dashing off again. Perry looked at Fleming, whose tail nub wagged furiously. You tore and dashed? Both in the same day? Good boy. Fleming barked once, sharp and proud, as if confirming the tale. Pete went on, his tone growing serious. Prior to leaving the safe house, Monsieur Duchamp had called in the details of your situation, your conclusions about the bomb's transport on a barge, Montmarch's target of point zero. I learned this when our superior contacted me. More? Perry asked, picturing Onyx Sector's enigmatic director. The same, Pete confirmed. He had assigned me to your hotel, knowing an explosives technician would likely be needed if we located the device in time. So, as I said, I knew these things, and to my great surprise, I realized Fleming was leading me toward the Seine, across from the Ile de la Cité. When he reached the bank, he resumed his mad spinning and barking routine. It was then I spotted the barge, moving north, only 100 meters from the cathedral. A small launch was moored nearby, and Fleming's antics drew the owner's attention. I begged him to take us alongside the barge. He refused at first, but I managed to convince him. Pete patted his holstered weapon, a sly grin flashing. He then left rather quickly, and I commandeered his vessel. Perry shook his head, marveling at the absurdity and sheer luck of it all. But still, how could Fleming have known I was in trouble or where I'd be? For that, I have no explanation, Pete said, his voice softening. Only gratitude that it does indeed seem to be the case. Animals have ways of knowing what we humans could only guess at. Or perhaps it was your guardian angel. Perry's lips curved into a quiet smile, his thoughts drifting to Trina, her blue eyes, her radiant presence, and his hallucination. Yes, he said, the guardian angel. I like that explanation. We'll go with that. 21. The week following the barge incident passed in a haze for Perry Hall, a relentless grind of debriefings and interrogations that left him drained. Holed up in Paris, he endured hours of questioning from Onyx handlers and French officials, the latter probing the depths of Pierre Montmarche's treachery. The revelation of Montmarche's dark dealings didn't shock them. His reputation as a ruthless financier preceded him, but the scale of his depravity, plotting to nuke Paris for profit, left even seasoned bureaucrats reeling. One part of the endless grind of paperwork and interviews that did please Perry, however, was that, based upon his description of Flick, they were able to cull through their massive database of known and suspected Scorpion operatives and come up with a probable match. That was their term. The moment Perry looked at the dossier, he knew it was him. Even though the man in the picture had a full beard, the Flick in Paris had been clean-shaven. Still, the details were incomplete and sketchy. Raul Ramon Hernandez, known to have associated with several confirmed Scorpion agents, though never confirmed to have acted in concert with any. The evidence might be inconclusive, but Perry knew this was his man, and now he had a face and a name. But he also knew Flick would not be easy to track down, even with the additional information. Montmarche had escaped as well, although that bothered Perry less. Finally, the paperwork and interviews concluded, releasing Perry from the bureaucratic stranglehold. The prospect of returning to New York loomed, unsettling in its quiet finality. His Brooklyn penthouse, once a sanctuary shared with Trina, now echoed with emptiness, a repository for memories he wasn't ready to face. Despite thwarting a catastrophe, the mission's success felt fragile, overshadowed by the specter of what could have been a city in ashes, millions dead, and Flick's taunting grin as he slipped away. When he left the nondescript building that served as Onyx Sector's main Paris headquarters, he saw it was nighttime, a lovely autumn evening. He had been walking for less than a minute when his phone rang. He looked at the screen, which read Le Gros Fromage, causing him to laugh out loud. He had forgotten that on the flight to Paris he'd warded off thoughts of Trina for a brief time by humorously changing people's names in his contact list. The Big Cheese was the name he'd selected for J. Carlton Moore, though under the circumstances, he chose to type it in French. Sir, Perry answered, his voice steady but tired. Eagle, you've cheated a gruesome death yet again, Moore said, his tone dry. Just can't seem to get it right, sir, Perry replied, matching the gallows humor. I've been told your final debriefing's concluded. You're booked on a midnight flight to New York. Should give you time to coerce your dog into his crate. He hates that thing, Perry said, picturing Fleming's mournful eyes at the sight of the travel kennel. From the sound of things, he should have the first-class seat, and you should be in the crate, Moore quipped. Odd how things go. You brought him along only because your usual sitter was unavailable. And if that weren't interesting enough in your report, you insist he was led to you by a guardian angel. A faint smile tugged at Perry's lips. That was Piet's idea, though it's as reasonable as any explanation I could come up with. Ah, yes, Piet, Moore said, a note of approval in his voice. His stock in the agency has certainly risen. Deservedly. He'd proven his worth even before saving the lives of over 2 million unsuspecting citizens. And thanks to the French government, they remain unsuspecting, Moore said. It's a thing of beauty when a country can keep something of this magnitude from public knowledge. On that point, you might get an argument, at least in the States, Perry countered, thinking of the American appetite for transparency, however messy. Moore cleared his throat, a subtle signal to move on. My point exactly. In any case, get yourself home. You've kept the shaking crystal goblet of faith I maintain in you on the shelf for another day. And with that, the line went dead. Perry smiled. He understood what Moore had meant. Although he remained able to go into a messy situation and get the job done, he was still a long way from regaining his top operative status. But he wasn't hurt by Moore's inability to trust him completely. He didn't trust himself. He had certainly played a major part in the mission's satisfactory outcome, but it could have very easily gone in a much different, unimaginably horrible direction. And that, just as much as any success, would have rested firmly on his shoulders. And he still had the empty penthouse to deal with when he got home. He was just about to slide his phone back into his pocket when he saw a group of women standing together in the glow of a streetlight. They were obviously prostitutes, and as he approached, they began to call to him, asking if he needed a date and offering other, less subtle services. He smiled and shook his head no, and was about to pass them by when he noticed the prettiest of the group was wearing a black spaghetti string tank top with the words Coeur d'Or emblazoned on it in sparkling sequins. He thought at once of Goran Spectruman's one request. Perhaps he couldn't bring him a hooker with a heart of gold, but he could text him a picture of one wearing a shirt that said exactly that. He asked if he could take her picture, and she indicated it would cost him 50 euros. Money well spent, he said, handing it over. He snapped the picture, and a few moments later he'd sent it to Spec with a caption, Payment in full. He was again about to slide the phone away when it buzzed once more. He assumed it would be Spectruman sending him a witty retort in broken English, but the caller ID read Hero. Piet. Monsieur Eagle. Piet's voice came through, bright with urgency. I'm sending you a picture. As the call continued, Perry's phone vibrated with an incoming text. He opened it, revealing a photo of an open-air market, vibrant with stalls and bustling crowds. Near a knife vendor stood a man whose face stopped Perry cold. Raul Ramon Hernandez, Flick, already sporting a mustache to alter his appearance, but those predatory eyes were unmistakable, searing into Perry's soul. When was this taken? Perry asked, his voice low, every muscle tensing. 4 hours ago. Where? Turkey, Istanbul. Perry's mind raced, but only for a moment. The midnight flight to New York faded from his plans. I need you to keep Fleming with you a little longer. He is resting quite comfortably on the foot of my bed, with a poodle lying next to him, Piet said, a smile in his voice. Well, tell him not to get too comfortable, Perry said, a grim determination settling in. I will see to it. And Monsieur Eagle? Yes, Piet. Make him suffer. Perry ended the call, his jaw set, his pulse quickening with purpose. He dialed another number, his fingers steady despite the fire igniting in his chest. A moment later, a polite voice answered. Air France, how may I help you? The end. This was For Spy Eyes Only, an Onyx Sector adventure, written by Craig A. Hart and S.J. Varango. Copyright 2025 by Craig A. Hart. Production copyright 2025 by Craig A. Hart.